Welcome to When the Bond Breaks, a werewolf-fated mate romance where fate is messy, the sparks are wild, and the full moon brings more than just fur and fangs. There's snark, steam, and a mate bond neither of them asked for but can't escape. Buckle up, pack. From haunted hearts to ancient curses, you'll find stories here that pull you in and don't let go. If you're into tales that twist the real and the unreal, you're in the right place. Nyxen Audiobooks. Hit that subscribe button and let's dive in. Loyalty is complicated. She felt it before she saw it. Not a subtle shift in the air or a fleeting shadow in her periphery. This was primal, immediate. That's how the bond worked, a vital organ, an extension of her soul tethered to his, a constant hum of connection singing beneath the surface of her life. It didn't whisper with gentle nudges or vague inklings. It wasn't a suggestion. It warned, a blaring siren in the quiet chambers of her heart, a klaxon announcing imminent danger, a sharp twist in her gut, like a phantom punch, a tightening in her chest, as if the universe were holding its breath waiting to see if she would follow the pull or pretend it wasn't there, bury her head in the sand, hoping the feeling would dissipate. Cleo stilled, brush-frozen mid-stroke through her long, ink-dark hair. The bristles threatened to snap under the sudden pressure of her grip. Her reflection stared back eyes, the color of stormy twilight, wide and suddenly glassy, reflecting the fear blooming within. Her soft brown skin, usually glowing with warmth, had gone pale beneath the vanity light, healthy flush replaced by a sickly pallor. There was a quiet strength to her features, the kind that didn't need a crown to demand respect, high cheekbones sculpted by resilience. A determined mouth, usually curved in a smile, now pressed into a thin, unforgiving line. A trail of faded scars barely visible across her collarbone, each one a story etched into her flesh, a testament to battles fought and won. She looked like a Luna, powerful, regal, untouchable. She didn't feel like one anymore. The weight of the title, usually a source of pride, now felt like a lead cloak threatening to drag her under. Her hands slipped, muscles suddenly unresponsive. The brush clattered against the edge of the vanity, a cheap ceramic echo in the opulent room. The sound shattered the silence like a scream in a cathedral, sharp and sacrilegious. Her breath caught, trapped in her chest. She gasped for air, but her lungs refused to cooperate. Maybe it's nothing, she thought desperately. A fleeting moment of anxiety. Maybe the bond was flaring up because Kodiak faced some threat she couldn't yet see. Maybe her mate was hurting. Grappling with a rogue, struggling against a curse, injured and alone somewhere in the vast territory. But no, the lie crumbled before she could fully form it. Deep in her chest, in the marrow of her bones, and the memory of his hands warm on her skin, she knew. Every fiber of her being screamed the truth. This wasn't a fear for his safety. This was betrayal. Cold, sharp, and devastating. Barefoot, heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, Cleo stepped into the hallway, pulled by something ancient and unrelenting, something that bypassed logic and appealed only to her soul. The scent hit her halfway down the corridor, a wave of cloying sweetness that made her stomach churn, not his usual mix of pine, storm-soaked earth, and that grounding warmth only she could ever describe as home. The scent that clung to his clothes embedded itself in her sheets and permeated every corner of their shared life. No, this was foreign, intrusive, and wrong. Strawberry wine. Sickly, sweet, and cheap. Vanilla. Artificial and overpowering. A woman's perfume, and something sharper. Something acrid that burned her nostrils. Something wrong. Profoundly, irrevocably wrong. Her breath caught again. A silent sob trapped in her throat. The hallway, once a comforting space, now felt like a treacherous labyrinth. The scent shouldn't have been there. It was an intruder, a violation. Not here. Not in the Alpha's private wing, the inner sanctum of their shared life, the place where they'd built their love and their future. Not when he told her he was working late, buried in pack business that kept him chained to his desk. Not when she'd waited up, a warm plate of food cooling on the stove, 1,000 unspoken words lingering on her tongue, ready to be shared under the soft glow of the bedside lamp. The hallway stretched too long, an infinite corridor of dread. Her feet felt leaden, weighted down by the burgeoning knowledge that threatened to crush her. But still, she walked, drawn by the breaking, compelled to witness the shattering of everything she held dear. The office door was open just enough, a sliver, a secret, begging to be kept, but not tonight. Tonight, the universe demanded she look. She stepped closer, slow, silent, each footfall an agonizing echo in the oppressive quiet. She didn't want to see. Ignorance was bliss, a shield against the pain that awaited her. She had to see. Denial was no longer an option. The truth, however brutal, demanded to be faced. One glance was all it took. An image seared into her memory, a brand upon her soul. Her matit man she'd pledged her life to, the other half of her soul pressed against the desk, his broad back to her, muscles flexing with a familiar intensity that twisted the knife in her gut. The Omega, a young, doe-eyed thing barely out of her teens, wrapped around him, legs locked tight around his lean hips, hands tangled in his dark hair. Her voice breathless and sweet with false innocence. "I've waited so long for you to do this," the Omega purred, her words dripping with triumph. He didn't answer, not with words. He didn't need to. His silence was a deafening confirmation. When his hand gripped the woman's waist the way he once held her, pulling her close with possessive hunger, tracing the same curves he'd sworn to cherish only on Cleo, the bond, once warm, golden, and pulsing with the promise of forever, shattered, not with fire, no explosive outburst of rage or sorrow, with silence, a sudden, terrifying vacuum where warmth and connection had once resided. A dead, empty silence that screamed louder than anything Cleo had ever heard, a silence that resonated with the death of her dreams, the annihilation of her faith. She didn't gasp. The sound died in her throat, choked by the weight of the betrayal. Didn't scream, her voice was gone, stolen by the shock that had paralyzed her from the inside out. Didn't cry. The tears were frozen, trapped behind a wall of disbelief. She turned and walked down the hall, her bare feet silent on the plush carpet. Through the bedroom, a room filled with memories now tainted and tarnished, pulling on clothes with numb fingers, each button a struggle, the zipper a betrayal, mind blank. A swirling vortex of nothingness, heart gone, ripped out of her chest and discarded like a worthless trinket. 3 shirts, layered for warmth but offering no solace. 2 pairs of jeans, pulled on haphazardly, the denim rough against her skin. No shoes, no time, no jacket. The chill was a welcome distraction from the heat of her shame. Gone. A ghost in the night, fading into the shadows. Leave before they noticed, before their moment of stolen pleasure ended, before he came to his senses, if he even had any left. Before she let herself fall apart, before the dam broke and unleashed the torrent of grief that threatened to drown her. And as she slipped away into the darkness, the emptiness, where their bond had been yawned wider with each step of void expanding within her chest, cold and infinite as the night that swallowed her whole. She ran into the forest with the wind chasing her, a rabid hound nipping at her heels. Skeletal branches clawed at her clothes, tore at her skin, but she didn't slow. Each gust seemed to whisper accusations, echoing the pain that clawed at her insides. Her breath came sharp and cold in her throat, each inhale a searing reminder of the betrayal. The air felt thin, starved of oxygen, just like her suddenly barren life. Feet bleeding against rocks and roots, she plunged deeper into the wilderness. The unforgiving ground seemed determined to punish her for every misstep, every naive belief. But the physical pain was a welcome distraction, a tangible focus for the rage and sorrow consuming her. She didn't shift. The wolf inside, usually a source of comfort and strength, remained dormant, refusing to offer solace. Perhaps even it was reeling, wounded by Kodiak's actions. Her wolf didn't howl. There was no release in a primal scream, no comfort in the wild chorus of her kind. Her pain was too personal, too raw to be charade, a solitary burden she had to carry alone. Didn't call for help. Who could help her now? The one person she thought she could depend on, the anchor in her storm-tossed sea, had willingly cut the rope. She just ran. A frantic, desperate escape from the wreckage of her life, from the memories that clung to her like cobwebs, suffocating and unwanted, like maybe if she moved fast enough, the pain wouldn't catch her. As if outrunning the physical distance could somehow erase the gaping wound in her soul. But it did. It always did. The memories, the betrayal, the sheer agonizing heartbreak, they were constant companions nestled deep within her bones, a heavy weight she couldn't shed. By sunrise, she was miles away. The landscape had softened, traded the oppressive darkness for the muted grays and greens of dawn. Somewhere quiet. The silence was unsettling, a stark contrast to the roaring chaos within her. She yearned for the familiar sounds of her pack, but the thought of facing them, of explaining what had happened, was unbearable, somewhere cold. The chill seeped into her bones, mirroring the numbness that had settled over her heart. The forest offered no embrace, no warmth, only the indifferent witness of nature. Somewhere no one knew her name. No one to recognize the pain etched on her face. No one to offer empty platitudes or pitying glances. Anonymity was a shield, a reprieve from the scrutiny she couldn't endure. She collapsed beneath a twisted tree, its gnarled branches mirroring the tangled mess of her emotions. Her body ached, exhausted from the relentless flight. Her soul was numb, a vast, echoing emptiness where love and trust once resided. And that's when the first tear fell. A single, defiant drop that traced a path down her cheek, carving a channel through the grime and sweat. Not for him, not for the love she had lost or the future she had envisioned, for what he took from her. The innocence, the trust, the unshakable belief in their bond. He had stolen something precious, something irreplaceable, and the loss resonated through her like a death knell. Kodiak woke alone. The sunlight streaming through the window felt accusatory, a harsh spotlight on his transgression. Dazed, confused. The lingering scent of cheap perfume and the phantom touch of unfamiliar skin were sickening reminders of his folly. The taste of another woman still on his tongue, a bitter, lingering poison. The pleasure of the previous night had evaporated, leaving behind only a residue of guilt and fear. The bond hadn't screamed yet, but it was unraveling, pulling threads he didn't notice until it was too late. He had been so caught up in fleeting gratification that he hadn't felt the subtle shifts, the imperceptible fraying of their sacred connection. Then the silence hit. A deafening, all-consuming void that replaced the constant hum of their shared consciousness. Not peace. He knew peace. This was its malevolent twin, the unnerving absence of her presence, the deafening echo of a connection severed. Absence. It was a physical weight, a hollowness that gnawed at his insides. He felt incomplete, as if a vital organ had been ripped from his chest. He staggered out of bed, propelled by a growing sense of dread, and stumbled to their shared bedroom. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of panic. Empty. The bed was meticulously made, devoid of any trace of her presence. A silent accusation, a stark reminder of the void he had created. No robe. He remembered seeing her favorite, a soft midnight blue silk draped across the chair last night. It was gone now, a symbol of her vanished warmth. No scent. The air was sterile, devoid of her distinctive fragrance, that blend of wildflowers and sunshine that always calmed him. The familiar aroma replaced by a chilled void. No warmth. The room radiated a glacial coldness that mirrored the ice forming in his heart. Her absence had sucked all life and vibrancy from the space. Just cold sheets and consequences. The realization of what he had done slammed into him with the force of a physical blow. His momentary lapse in judgment had cost him everything. No, no, he growled to himself. The denial, a desperate plea against the inevitable truth. He ran a hand through his hair, his fingers shaking. Then louder, fear lacing his voice, a desperate attempt to rewind time, to undo the damage he had inflicted. What have I done? The question echoed in the empty room, unanswered, hanging in the air like a curse. And still louder, voice cracking, barely human, a raw, guttural sound of despair. Oh, I'm so stupid, oh my God, she knows. The realization hit him with full force, the weight of his betrayal crushing him. He had broken their sacred bond, shattered her trust, and now he was left to face the consequences. He shifted. The transformation was clumsy, fueled by adrenaline and desperation. He ran through the woods, paws pounding against the earth, mirroring the frantic rhythm of his heart. Called her name until his throat bled, the sound a mournful howl carried on the wind. But she'd left nothing. No note, not even a goodbye. Just silence, an agonizing silence that screamed volumes. No scent trail. She had deliberately masked her scent, shrouding her escape in secrecy. A clear message. She didn't want to be found. No trace. It was as if she had vanished into thin air, erased from existence. Just air where she used to be. A vacant space in his life. A constant reminder of what he had lost. Nico found him hours later at the forest edge, pacing like a wolf going feral. Kodiak's eyes were wild, his fur matted, his entire being radiating a palpable sense of despair. She broke the bond, Nico said, jaw tight, his voice devoid of sympathy. He couldn't mask the disappointment in his eyes. I can feel it. Kodiak didn't respond. He didn't need to. The truth was etched on his face, a testament to his catastrophic failure. He knew. He felt it. The agonizing severing of the connection that had defined him for so long, felt the hollow where her presence used to live, a gaping wound in his soul that threatened to consume him. Felt the fire he'd snuffed out with his own hands, the warmth, the light, the life she had brought into his world, all extinguished by his selfish act. And miles away, deep in the woods, curled beneath a twisted tree, Cleo whispered to the stars, her voice barely audible above the rustling leaves. I hope you were watching, Moon. She lifted her gaze to the celestial orb, a silent plea for understanding. I hope you saw what your chosen one did. A bitter taste filled her mouth, the taste of betrayal and broken promises. She had placed her faith in Kodiak, and he had shattered it with casual disregard. Now she was alone, adrift in a world that suddenly felt cold and hostile. The moon, her silent witness, offered no comfort, only the cold, indifferent light of truth. As darkness fell once more, Cleo felt something new, stirring within the emptiness where her bond had been. Not healing, it was far too soon for that, but something equally powerful taking root, resolve. This world had taken everything from her, her mate, her pack, her place, her purpose, but it hadn't taken her will. And as she closed her eyes against the encroaching night, she made herself a promise. This would not break her, not completely, not forever. The bond might be gone, but she remained. And that would have to be enough. The pack felt the shift immediately, not through words, not through howls. Through her absence, Cleo was gone, and even those who didn't know why instinctively knew. The woman who held the heart of the territory with quiet strength and unwavering loyalty had vanished without a trace, leaving a void that echoed through the very air they breathed. Whispers danced on the wind, unspoken questions hanging heavy. They dared not ask outright, for fear of what answers might come. Dared not approach Kodiak or Nico, sensing the volatile storm brewing within the Alpha's quarters, but they felt the weight of it in the air, the subtle disruption in the pack's harmony. Something catastrophic had happened. A seismic event had rocked their world. They just didn't know yet how one moment could fracture everything, leaving cracks that might never fully heal. Inside the Alpha's quarters, Kodiak sat hunched at the edge of the bed, shirt unbuttoned and hanging open, his bare chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. His elbows rested on his knees, head bowed low as if under the weight of the world. He was a statue of despair, carved from the very stone of his guilt. The moonlight poured through the window, a stark spotlight, catching the harsh lines of his face, the tight set of his jaw, the dark eyes now dulled with regret. The once proud glint that had always burned within them was reduced to ash, a smoldering reminder of what he'd lost. Broad-shouldered and tall, every inch a warrior forged in countless battles, but tonight he looked broken. He looked like a man brought to his knees by his own hands, the weight of his actions crushing him beneath their invisible force. Nico stood at the window, arms crossed, the tension radiating off him like heat from a forge. He was a coiled spring, ready to snap but holding himself in check. The silence in the room was thick, suffocating. It had been hours, hours of agonizing quiet, punctuated only by the barely audible sound of Kodiak's breathing. The room still reeked of guilt, clinging to the very fabric of the space, a suffocating smog of regret, of her absence. The emptiness where her presence used to be was a tangible thing, a gaping wound in the heart of the room. Of everything Kodiak wasn't saying, the unspoken truth was a heavy burden weighing them both down. Finally, Nico turned from the window, his patience frayed. "Say something." His voice was low, rough with emotion. No response. Kodiak remained a silent, unmoving figure of misery. "Why, Kodiak?" he pushed, his voice laced with a mixture of pain and disbelief. "Why her?" Kodiak didn't look up. His voice was a broken whisper. "I can't believe I was that stupid." "Neither can I." Nico crossed the room, his movements deliberate and controlled. His voice was low but clear, each word carefully chosen, meant to reach through the Alpha's self-imposed isolation. "You broke her, Kodiak. You shattered the one thing that held us all together. You don't deserve silence. You deserve to face this. And she gave you peace on her way out, a final act of grace you don't deserve." Kodiak shifted slightly, his broad shoulders tensing. "Careful, Nico." A low warning, but lacking conviction. "I'm still here and careful," Nico replied, stepping closer, his eyes burning with intensity. "That's the only reason I'm talking to you instead of using my fists. You thought she wouldn't find out? That the bond wouldn't feel the betrayal? That the link between you two would just ignore it?" Kodiak's voice cracked, a raw sound of anguish. "It was one stupid moment. Yeah, and it cost you the only thing that ever made you an alpha worth following. It cost you the respect of this pack. It cost you her." Nico's words landed like body blows, but there was pain beneath the accusations, the pain of someone who cared deeply for them both. "You traded it for a moment of weakness, and now we're all paying the price." A knock at the door, sharp and insistent, broke the tension in the room. Then, without permission, the door swung inward. She stood there, framed in the doorway like a predator surveying its prey, the Omega. The same one whose scent still clung to the corners of the room, a lingering reminder of Kodiak's transgression. She leaned against the doorway with calculated ease, her posture radiating a smug confidence that made Nico's hackles rise. Her smile was syrup-sweet, a veneer of innocence masking a predatory ambition. "Alpha," she cooed, stepping forward into the room, her eyes fixed on Kodiak. "You disappeared so fast. I thought maybe you were brazen, aren't we?" Nico cut her off, his voice dropping to a dangerous pitch. "Who said you could come in here? Get out." She blinked, seemingly unfazed by his hostility. "I wasn't talking to you, Nico." Her voice was laced with a deliberate sweetness, designed to provoke. He crossed the room in 2 swift strides, closing the distance between them until they were standing toe-to-toe. His eyes were like steel, radiating a controlled fury that made her confidence waver despite herself. "I don't care who you were talking to," he said, each syllable precise and cutting. "You shamelessly thought you could just enter these quarters? You show your face in here again, and I'll personally drag you out by the scruff of your neck. Understood?" She looked over his shoulder at Kodiak, still silent and looking the other way, not giving her an audience. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face, but she quickly masked it. "Alpha?" she asked, her voice softer this time, laced with a calculated vulnerability. "You're not going to let him—" "He already has," Nico cut in, his voice a low rumble. "Keep pushing, and you'll discover exactly where my loyalties lie. And it's not with opportunists." Her voice wavered, the syrup of her false sweetness beginning to curdle. "But I thought—" "You thought wrong." Nico leaned closer, his voice dropping to a cold whisper that sent a shiver down her spine. "You thought one night of weakness meant something. That it gave you status, power, that it meant you could replace her." He shook his head, a dismissive gesture that highlighted her insignificance. "It gave you nothing. It bought you a moment. And now that moment is over. Her gaze darted back to Kodiak, pleading, desperate for a sign of support. Please, say something. Kodiak's growl rumbled from deep in his chest, a primal sound of pain and regret. Leave! The single word cracked through the room like thunder, shaking the very foundations of her confidence. Do not show your face here again. His voice was laced with a raw, untamed fury that made her flinch. The Omega cowered, her head bowed in submission. The power in his voice was undeniable, a stark reminder of his alpha status, despite his current broken state. Nico opened the door wider, his expression implacable. Move, he said, his voice sharp and devoid of any sympathy. And take this as your final warning. Push this, and you'll find yourself without a pack. She hesitated for a moment, clinging to the last vestiges of her ambition. But the look in Nico's eyes was enough to make her reconsider. She kept her head low as she backed out of the room, her dreams of power dissolving into dust. Then she turned and fled, disappearing into the shadows. The slam of the door behind her reverberated through the room, a resounding punctuation to her failed power play. Nico stood in the silence for a long moment, his chest rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths. The tension in the room remained palpable, a heavy weight that pressed down on them both. That's done, he said, finally breaking the silence. His voice softened slightly, the edge of anger giving way to something deeper. Concern, disappointment, loyalty, despite everything. But this mess, Kodiak, this is just the beginning. You think this is over? You're wrong. This is just the first crack. And the fallout. He glanced toward the window, toward where Cleo had disappeared into the night. The fallout is going to be a long time coming. Kodiak finally looked up, his eyes meeting Nico's for the first time since the confrontation began. In them, Nico saw not the alpha who had led them through countless battles, but a man drowning in the consequences of his own actions. I know, Kodiak whispered, the words barely audible. I know. The elders circled the long, polished wooden table like wolves closing in on wounded prey, except this prey had already bled itself dry, leaving nothing but bone and regret. The air hung heavy with tension, thick with unspoken accusations. Cleo's left? Said Elder Mira, her voice sharp and cold, slicing through the air like a shard of ice. And not quietly. The whole territory felt the break. It was a tear. We need answers, Kodiak. Something monumental happened, and as council, we have a right to know. How does a Luna just disappear? Another elder added, his voice laced with disbelief and thinly veiled outrage. Was she sick, attacked, was she taken? I was in the infirmary all day, said the young healer, her voice soft and hesitant. Looking after a sick pup, she wasn't there. No sign of struggle, nothing out of place. Kodiak stood at the head of the room, a granite statue amidst a storm of whispered anxieties. His arms were crossed over his broad chest, his face an unreadable mask. The weight of leadership, the burden of responsibility, pressed down on him. I don't know where she is, he said quietly, his voice resonating with a suppressed pain. I've lost her scent. It's gone. This is my fault, my mistake. And I'll fix it. Nico stood silently beside him, his presence a solid support despite his own anger. He watched, his dark eyes sharp and observant, taking in the nuances of the scene. His loyalty to the pack was unwavering, a silent promise etched into his very being. Will she return? Someone asked, the question heavy with hope and desperation. Kodiak didn't hesitate, his voice firm despite the turmoil within. No, not unless she chooses to. I won't force her. And you? Elder Mira demanded, her gaze unwavering. Will you chase her? Will you bring her back? He shook his head, the movement small and deliberate. I have no right to. She needs to decide for herself. Outside the council room, the pack murmured, their voices a low hum of speculation and concern. The news of Cleo's disappearance had spread like wildfire, casting a shadow over their community. Some spoke in sympathy, worried about their alpha's well-being and the future of their pack. Some spoke in judgment, whispering about weakness and betrayal. They questioned Kodiak's leadership, his fitness to lead without his Luna by his side. But the Omega? The one who had dared to dream of a place beside the Alpha? She wasn't welcome anymore. She was an outcast, a pariah. Her name was whispered with venom, spat out like a curse. She's the one who betrayed the Luna. She drove her away. The Alpha won't even look at her. He can barely stand to be in the same room. She thought she could climb ranks with her pretty face. She failed, miserably. No one spoke to her. She was ignored, ostracized, and invisible. No one trained with her. She was shunned, isolated, a ghost in their midst. No one saw her. To be a shunned wolf, to be unseen and unheard, was worse than not existing at all. It was a slow, agonizing death of the spirit, because no one respected a wolf who hunted what already belonged to the moon. They were predators, not partners, and their ambition was a stain on the pack's honor. That night, Kodiak stood alone in Cleo's garden, untouched since she left. The flowers were starting to wither, the once vibrant colors fading. It was a stark reminder of what had been lost, of the beauty that had slipped through his fingers. He crouched by the flower bed she used to tend with such loving care, his fingers sifting through the soil as if he could find her scent buried there, a trace of her presence lingering in the earth. The moonlight spilled across his face, highlighting the lines of weariness and regret etched around his eyes. It felt less like comfort, less like the gentle caress of the moon goddess, and more like judgment, a silent condemnation of his failures. Behind him, Nico's voice broke the silence, soft but firm. "You didn't just lose her, Kodiak." He didn't look up, his gaze fixed on the barren earth. "I know. You lost yourself too." Kodiak rose slowly, brushing dirt from his hands, his movements heavy with grief. "Then I guess I'll have to earn both back." Nico gave a single nod, his expression grave. "Start by staying quiet. Let the pack settle. When the moon wants to speak again, she'll do it through her. Trust in that." They stood in silence, the only sound the gentle whisper of the wind rustling through the leaves of the ancient oak tree that stood sentinel over the garden. As the wind carried Cleo's scent away for good, scattering it amongst the stars, Kodiak knew his journey had just begun. He had to find a way to find both Cleo and the man he was before he broke her trust and chased her away. Back in the small bookstore, as dusk settled over the town, the tiny bell above the door chimed softly, a delicate sound in the otherwise quiet bookstore. Cleo, her fingers dusted with the scent of aged paper, wiped at the cover of an old hardback copy of Leaves of Grass, revealing a faded gold title. She turned, a quiet smile gracing her lips. A woman, her hair streaked with silver and carrying a worn leather satchel, stood just inside. "I'm looking for poetry," the woman said, her voice a low, pleasant rumble. Cleo gestured towards the back of the store, the smile never quite reaching her eyes. "That way." She didn't say much more, just a nod and a quick point. Still hadn't gotten used to using her voice again. It felt rusty, unused, like an old hinge screaming after years of silence. Words caught in her throat, refusing to be released. But in this small town, nestled amongst rolling hills and whispering pines, she didn't need to speak much. The people here respected silence. They respected space, the unspoken understanding between two souls occupying the same moment. They understood that sometimes the loudest expressions were the ones left unsaid. And she needed that more than anything. It was a balm to her wounded spirit, a sanctuary for her weary soul. After the customer disappeared into the poetry section, Mr. Elsner, the bookstore owner, peeked from behind a tall, teetering stack of biographies. His eyes, magnified by thick spectacles, twinkled with an ageless wisdom. The old man smiled gently, the crinkles around his eyes deepening. "You ever think about what came before this life, Cleo?" he asked, his voice a soft rasp. She paused, her hands resting protectively on the stack of books, her gaze drifting towards the sunlight filtering through the dusty window. "Every day," she admitted, the words barely a whisper. The memories, fragmented and painful, were constant companions, the life she'd left behind, the life that still haunted her dreams. He nodded slowly, a knowing look in his eyes, like he understood something she didn't need to say aloud. "You don't have to tell me. Just glad you're here." Her chest tightened, a familiar ache blooming beneath her ribs. Gratitude warred with a deep-seated fear. She didn't deserve this quiet, this peace. She didn't respond, simply returning his smile with a small, vulnerable one of her own. But she didn't leave either. She stayed, anchored to this small bookstore, to this quiet town, to the silent understanding she shared with Mr. Elsner. In the 6 months since she'd arrived, her body had begun to heal. The hollow feeling where the bond had been no longer felt like an open wound, more like a phantom limb, something missing that she still reached for in the quiet moments between sleep and waking. The wolf inside her had grown quiet, subdued, not gone, never gone, just waiting, watching through her eyes as she built this fragile new existence, one careful breath at a time. Cleo locked the front door and pulled down the blinds. The space felt different after hours, more intimate, filled with whispers from thousands of stories surrounding her. She ran her fingertips along the spines as she walked toward the back room, a silent greeting to old friends. Tonight, though, something felt different. A restlessness in her blood, an itch beneath her skin. The moon was full. She paused by the window, peering through a gap in the blinds at the glowing orb hanging heavy in the night sky. For the first time in months, she felt her wolf stir, a low rumble of awakening desire. "I'm not ready," she whispered to the empty room, to her wolf, to herself. But maybe it wasn't about being ready. Maybe it was about accepting that some parts of herself couldn't be buried forever. Not the wolf, not the memories, not the hollow space where her bond had been. She closed her eyes, letting the moonlight bathe her face through the window. Just for a moment, she allowed herself to remember what it felt like to run free, to belong to something larger than herself. Then she turned away, back to her small life, her quiet existence. One day at a time, one breath, one heartbeat, one moment of peace. It would have to be enough. The town wasn't a destination. It was a place of transit, a forgotten stop on the map, the kind of place people passed through on their way to somewhere else, not somewhere they actively sought out. It offered no attractions, no vibrant nightlife, no compelling reason to linger. Quiet streets, lined with buildings that whispered of a bygone era, spoke of a slow-paced existence. Faded brick buildings stood shoulder to shoulder, their paint peeling like sunburnt skin. A general store, its wooden porch sagging slightly, displayed dusty wares in the window. A post office, seemingly frozen in time, hadn't been updated in 30 years, its faded sign a testament to its unchanging nature. And nestled inconspicuously between a bakery, its aroma, a faint invitation, and a clothing shop displaying out-of-season garments, was a narrow, 2-story bookstore with sun-bleached windows. The glass, once clear, was now milky and opaque, hinting at the literary treasures hidden within. It was the last place Nico ever expected to find her. A town so unremarkable, so devoid of significance, seemed an impossible refuge for someone of her stature, of her past. He and Kodiak had arrived that morning, summoned not by any personal desire, but by the rigid dictates of their positions. They were invited by the local alpha to discuss ongoing border issues and the tedious ritual of renewing trade agreements. Neutral territory had been selected, a deliberate attempt to maintain civility. Pointless, Nico thought, as all these meetings usually were, a dance of diplomacy that masked deeper tensions. Nico hadn't paid much attention to the alpha's droning voice or the carefully constructed arguments. His thoughts were divided. Half of his attention was consumed by Kodiak, who sat beside him, tense, silent, and still, drowning in the suffocating guilt that clung to him like a shroud. The other half was a battle against his own simmering emotions, a war of restraint that threatened to break the surface at any moment. With every passing second, his control wore thinner. After the drawn-out meeting finally concluded, Kodiak stayed behind to hammer out the final terms, his voice low and serious. Nico, desperate for a reprieve, offered to grab coffee for the road, a flimsy excuse to escape the stifling atmosphere. He stepped out into the late morning sun, the warmth a welcome contrast to the cool, stale air of the meeting room. He walked half a block, the silence of the town broken only by the distant chirping of birds, and froze, every muscle in his body locked, his breath catching in his throat. The world seemed to shrink, focusing only on the figure before him. She stepped out of the bookstore just ahead of him, sunlight catching the dust motes dancing in the air around her. A stack of worn books, their spines cracked and faded, rested securely in her arms. They were held close, as if guarding a precious secret. Her hair, usually styled with impeccable care, was simply tied back, a loose braid escaping and falling over her shoulder. The casualness was jarring, yet captivating. She was wearing jeans, faded and worn soft with age, and a flannel shirt, the colors muted by countless washes. The fabric clung to her frame, revealing the subtle curves he remembered so well. No makeup adorned her face, no elaborate jewelry sparkled at her throat or wrists. The absence of artifice was striking. And most noticeably, no Luna aura shimmered around her. The radiant glow that had once defined her presence, marking her as the leader of their pack, was gone. Just her. Stripped bare of the titles and expectations that had once burdened her. And she looked whole, not untouched by the hardships she'd faced, but complete in a way he had never seen before. Not healed, not yet. The scars were still there, etched into her very being, but alive. A spark flickered in her eyes, a testament to her resilience. Nico didn't call out, didn't move. He was a statue, rooted to the spot, afraid to break the fragile spell that had settled over them. He watched, unseen, as she handed the stack of books to an older man who was sweeping the front step of the bookstore, his face etched with the stories of a long life. They laughed together, a genuine, easy sound that resonated with a warmth he hadn't heard in what felt like a lifetime. She looked up at the sky, her face tilted to the light, as if seeking solace from the sun's rays, and he saw the shadows under her eyes, the subtle telltale signs of sleepless nights. The one's grief leaves behind, stubborn and persistent. The one's betrayal never fully fades, no matter how much time passes. And still, despite the pain that lingered, she glowed. An inner radiance that defied the darkness, not like a Luna, powerful and commanding, but like a woman who had every reason to stay hidden, to succumb to the weight of her past, but chose not to. A quiet strength emanated from her, a silent promise of a future she was determined to build. She turned. The movement was slow, deliberate, as if she sensed his presence. Their eyes met. The world narrowed again, the sounds of the town fading into a muffled background hum. Her smile, fleeting and fragile, vanished as quickly as it appeared. Her expression hardened, a mask of guarded reserve falling into place. She stopped walking, her feet rooted to the spot, mirroring his paralysis. So did he. The unspoken history between them hung heavy in the air, a palpable tension that thickened with each passing second. The air thickened between them, charged with unspoken words, regrets, and a longing that had never truly been extinguished. The space felt electric, a dangerous proximity that threatened to ignite everything they had both tried so hard to bury. Neither moved, locked in a silent standoff, their eyes the only conduit for the storm of emotions that raged within them. Then she blinked, slow, guarded, deliberately breaking the connection. The walls slid back into place, a calculated defense against the vulnerability he represented. The Luna he once knew vanished, replaced by a stranger with haunted eyes. Nico raised a hand, not in a wave of greeting, not in a plea for forgiveness, just a quiet acknowledgement of her presence, a silent offering of respect. She gave a small nod, a hesitant, almost imperceptible movement of her head. It was a polite dismissal, a clear indication that he was not welcome. Then she turned, walked back into the bookstore, and closed the door with a soft click, the sound echoing in the sudden silence. The finality of the gesture was unmistakable. He stood there a long moment, the sun beating down on his back, the weight of the past crushing him. Then he exhaled, the breath a ragged sigh, ran a hand down his face, as if trying to erase the image of her, and headed back to the inn where Kodiak waited, the coffee forgotten, the border issues a distant concern. The encounter had changed everything. Inside the dimly lit room, the air thick with the scent of stale coffee and old paper, Kodiak looked up from the tattered map spread across the table. His brow was furrowed in concentration, fingers tracing worn roads and faded landmarks. "You were gone a while," he said, his voice low and gravelly, a hint of anxiety lacing his words. Nico shut the door behind him with a soft click, the sound echoing in the small space. He leaned against the cool wood, catching his breath. "I saw her." Kodiak's head snapped up, his eyes widening with a mixture of disbelief and raw hope. "What? She's alive," Nico said, the words hanging heavy in the air. "She's here." Kodiak stared, his mind struggling to process the information. "Here? In this town? After all this time?" "Bookstore on the corner," Nico explained, a faint smile touching his lips. "She works there. Did she see you?" Kodiak pressed, his voice tight with anticipation. Nico nodded, the memory playing out in his mind. The surprise in her eyes, the flicker of recognition. "And?" Kodiak prompted, his hands clenching into fists on the table. "She didn't run," he said, carefully choosing his words. "But she didn't smile either." Kodiak swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "She looks okay? Healthy?" Nico's eyes softened, a hint of sadness creeping in. She looked strong, like she'd weathered a storm and come out on the other side. Silence settled between them like dust, a heavy blanket of unspoken words and shared history. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator in the corner. Then, quieter, almost a whisper. "Did she look happy?" Nico hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. He remembered her face, the lines etched around her eyes, the subtle weariness in her posture. She looked free. The word hung in the air, a bittersweet melody. Kodiak didn't respond, didn't move a muscle, just sat there, eyes locked on nothing, like the air had been knocked out of him. The revelation hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and leaving him numb. Nico dropped into the chair across from him, his movements slow and deliberate, his eyes filled with concern. "I didn't tell her you were here. In fact, I never said a word." "Good." Kodiak rasped, his voice barely audible. "You want me to go back?" Nico offered, his hand hovering over Kodiak's on the table. "No. Well, that's up to you, Nico." Nico leaned forward, arms braced on his knees, studying Kodiak's face. "She looked different, Kodiak. Just different." "Yeah?" Kodiak said, his voice laced with a weary cynicism. "She looked like someone who finally figured out what peace sounds like." Nico said softly, hoping to break through the wall of guilt and regret that he knew Kodiak was building around himself. Kodiak gave a short, bitter laugh, the sound devoid of any joy. "And I'm the one who gave her the silence to find it." That evening, as dusk painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, Nico found himself drawn back to the bookstore. He told himself he was just taking a walk, stretching his legs after being cooped up inside all day, but he knew the truth. He needed to see her again, to reassure himself that she was there. Lights still on, casting a warm glow onto the sidewalk. Through the window, he saw her in the back, shelving books. Her movements were deliberate, focused. She wore a simple blue dress, and her hair was pulled back in a loose braid. Calm, focused, a little tired, but radiating an inner strength that he hadn't seen before. Then she paused, her hand hovering over a shelf, her head tilted slightly. Just for a moment, she looked toward the window. Their eyes met again, across the distance and through the glass. He held his breath, waiting, searching for a sign. And this time, there was something in hers. Not warmth, not forgiveness, not an accusation, just quiet understanding. As if she saw him, knew why he was there, and didn't blame him for looking. Nico gave her a small, respectful nod, a silent acknowledgement of her strength and resilience. He wouldn't intrude, wouldn't force anything. He knew that the ball was in her court now. Then he turned and moved on, melting back into the shadows of the evening. He wouldn't push. Not yet. He knew he had to give her space, time to process everything. But she wasn't a ghost anymore. She wasn't just a memory, a phantom limb that haunted his dreams. She was real. Present. Safe. And when he looked up at the sky, at the vast expanse of stars twinkling above, he could feel it. A sense of hope. a whisper of possibility. So could she. In the quiet sanctuary of her bookstore, surrounded by stories and the scent of aged paper, she felt it too. A connection, a subtle shift in the universe. The moon was watching, a silent witness to their unspoken reunion, bathing the world in its silvery light. Nico returned the next morning. The sun was higher, the shadows shorter than yesterday, as if even the world was a little less burdened, not in a hurry. He didn't burst through the door, a whirlwind of apologies and urgent explanations. He didn't pace or fidget. He moved with a quiet deliberation, not with an agenda. He wasn't there to force a reconciliation, demand answers, or drag her back into a life she'd consciously left behind. Just with 2 cups of coffee, and the look of a man who wasn't trying to fix the past, just soften it. There was a weariness etched into the lines around his eyes, a gentle sadness that suggested he carried his share of the guilt and regret. The bookstore was quiet. A few locals browsed the shelves, their fingers tracing spines with a practiced familiarity. The air smelled of aged paper and brewing tea. Soft jazz floated from an old radio behind the counter, a melancholy soundtrack to the unspoken history hanging in the air. Cleo stood in the poetry section, thumbing through something heartbreak-shaped, a collection of sonnets bound in faded velvet. The words blurred before her eyes, irrelevant to the poem she was reading. She felt him enter, a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a familiar presence that sparked a primal unease deep within her. "Luna," he said softly, his voice a low rumble that resonated through the quiet shop. His eyes scanned the aisles, searching for her, a flicker of hope amidst the apprehension. It felt good to say it again, good like scratching an old itch you weren't supposed to acknowledge. Like a child whispering their mother's name after doing something wrong, seeking comfort and absolution. Like reaching for something they already knew they'd lost, the phantom limb of a shattered family. When she turned and saw him standing there, coffee in both hands, a hesitant smile playing on his lips, she didn't expect him to use her pack name, Luna. It was a title, a responsibility, a part of her identity she thought she'd buried. She didn't expect anything. After so long, after so much pain, expectations were a luxury she couldn't afford. But it still made her chest ache, a sharp, unexpected pang that stole her breath, not just from the weight of him, the sheer physical presence of the man who had once been her brother, her protector, but the grief of the family, the deep, hollow ache of what was broken, what could never be repaired, of what they used to be, a unit, a force, a family bound by blood and magic. Now just echoes in the silence. Nico walked slowly to the counter, a careful, measured pace. He gently set one of the cups down, the ceramic clinking softly against the worn wood. "Don't worry," he said, his voice low and reassuring. "I'm not here to pressure you. Kodiak and I are in town for pack meetings." The unspoken name hung heavy in the air, a reminder of the betrayal that had shattered their world. She didn't respond, just watched him, guarded, her expression unreadable. The years had changed him. He looked older, more burdened, his eyes holding a story she didn't know if she wanted to hear. He nodded toward the cup, the aroma of hazelnut coffee filling the air. "Hazelnut, still your favorite?" A small gesture, a plea for connection. "That depends on who's asking." Her voice was cool, detached, a shield against the vulnerability she felt rising within her. Nico offered a tired smile, a shadow of the easy camaraderie they once shared. An old friend. If that still applies, she stepped forward. Not to him, just to the counter, maintaining the space between them. Picked up the cup, warm against her cold fingers. Real. A tangible offering in a world of ghosts. "I've thought about this," she said, her gaze fixed on the swirling coffee. "What I'd say if I ever saw either of you again." She hadn't just thought about it. She'd rehearsed it, rewritten it, dissected it 1,000 times in her mind. He gave a slow nod, his eyes never leaving her face. "And?" "I expected apologies, explanations, maybe some groveling." A flicker of the old Luna, the fierce, demanding leader, surfaced in her tone. "I can give you one of those." His voice was steady, without hesitation. Her brow lifted slightly, a spark of surprise igniting in her eyes. Which one? He met her eyes, his gaze unwavering. An apology. For not stopping him. For not seeing it coming. He spoke with a sincerity that resonated deep within her, cutting through her defenses. You didn't break the bond. It was a statement, not an accusation. The ultimate transgression. The one unforgivable act. No, he said, his voice laced with regret. But I didn't protect it either. He'd stood by, a silent witness to the destruction, and in her eyes, that made him just as culpable. She looked away, toward the window, her gaze lost in the blurry reflection of the street outside. I felt it, she murmured, her voice barely audible. Every second of it. The scent, the sound, the way he looked at her was like he used to look at me. The memory was a fresh wound, throbbing with pain and betrayal. Her voice cracked, just once, betraying the carefully constructed facade of indifference. I thought the bond would keep me safe. That unbreakable connection, the ancient magic that had defined her life, had failed her. So did we, Nico said quietly, his voice heavy with the weight of their shared delusion. A pause. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken accusations and buried grief. Then, gently, have you been okay, Luna? He wasn't asking about the coffee, or the bookstore, or the weather. He was asking about her soul. It wasn't the question that surprised her. It was the genuine concern in his voice, the raw sincerity in his eyes. It was that he meant it. After all this time, after all the hurt, he still cared. She blinked, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill over. The cup warmed her fingers, but her chest still felt cold, hollowed out by years of pain and loneliness. I'm getting there, she said, the admission a small victory in itself. That's enough, he replied, his voice soft and understanding. For now, he wasn't demanding closure, or forgiveness, or a return to the past. He was simply offering a hand, a lifeline, a promise that she wasn't alone, and for now, that was enough. She looked at him again, really looked, not through the lens of pack politics, not through the ingrained hierarchy that had defined their lives for as long as she could remember. He wasn't the beta right now. The ever-loyal second-in-command, the steadfast support. He wasn't Kodiak's shadow, a mere extension of their alpha's will. He was Nico. A man standing before her, his green eyes holding a depth she hadn't allowed herself to see in years. He was someone who missed her, not for her title, not for the power she held within the pack, not for the strategic advantage she offered, but because she was her. Because a part of him, a significant part, felt the absence as keenly as she did. Because she was part of him too, a missing piece of his own life. And something in her loosened. The iron grip she had maintained on her emotions, the wall she had painstakingly constructed brick by brick, loosened just a fraction. Not much. It was a crack, a sliver of light in the suffocating darkness. But enough. Enough to let him in. Just a little. Enough to acknowledge the ache that had become a constant companion. I don't want to talk about him, she said, the words coming out raspy, unused. Kodiak's name hung unspoken in the air between them, a heavy, unspoken burden. You don't have to, Nico replied, his voice low and even, devoid of pressure. He wasn't there to force her. He was simply there. I don't want to come back, she confessed, the truth as bitter on her tongue as unsweetened coffee. The life she had left behind was a ghost, haunting her present. I didn't ask you to. His words were a balm, a surprising reassurance. He wasn't pleading, guilt, tripping, or demanding. He was offering her space. She took a sip of the coffee. It was perfect, rich, dark, and comforting, which only made it harder. It was a cruel reminder of the simple pleasures she had sacrificed, the small joys she had denied herself. Why did you come? She asked, needing to understand. He needed to know what had driven him to seek her out after all this time. Nico turned toward the window, his gaze fixed on the quiet street outside. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the worn floorboards. Because I saw you. A glimpse, a whisper in the wind, and I realized no one ever asked how you were doing. Everyone just asked where you went, not why you had to, and I needed to ask the question and hear for myself that you were okay, Luna." Her throat tightened. The simple truth of his words resonated with a painful clarity. No one had ever said that. Not once. Not her mother, not her friends, not even Kodiak. They had all been so focused on the void she had left, on the power vacuum, on the repercussions of her departure, that they had completely overlooked the reason she had left in the first place. They hadn't considered her pain, her struggle, her need to escape. He turned to go, paused at the door, his hand resting on the worn frame. "For what it's worth," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "the pack misses you." She didn't answer. What could she say? The knowledge was a double-edged sword, a reminder of the connections she had severed, the responsibilities she had abandoned, and Kodiak. He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck, a gesture that betrayed a rare vulnerability. "He's surviving, but he's not living. Not really." She stared at the floor, tracing the patterns in the wood with her eyes. The words hit home, a confirmation of her fears. "Neither am I. Not really." The admission was a whisper, barely audible, but it was there, hanging in the air between them. He gave a small nod, acknowledging her pain, her truth. He didn't offer false platitudes or empty promises. He simply understood, then left. The door swung shut behind him. The bell above the door chimed behind him, its cheerful sound a stark contrast to the somber atmosphere he had left behind. The small shop felt suddenly empty, colder. She stood there long after he was gone, holding the coffee cup like it might keep her upright, like it was the only thing tethering her to reality. Maybe it did. Or maybe it was the echo of his words, a fragile lifeline in the sea of her despair. Later that night, while closing up the shop, she found a folded slip of paper tucked under the now empty cup. Her heart leaped, then plummeted. For a brief, irrational moment, she had hoped it was from Kodiak. But then she remembered Nico's visit, the way he had looked at her, the unburdening weight of his words. It wasn't from Kodiak, not a plea for her return, not a promise of change, just one line. Nico's handwriting, neat and sharp, is a reflection of the man himself. Some things are worth rebuilding, even if it takes time. She folded it slowly, carefully creasing the paper along its existing lines. The words sank in, a seed planted in the barren landscape of her heart. Slipped it into her pocket, close to her heart. A small, tangible reminder of hope. Then locked the door behind her, stepping out into the cool night air. The weight of the day, the weight of her past, still pressed down on her. But tonight, there was something else too, a flicker of possibility, a whisper of hope. The first tentative step towards rebuilding, perhaps. The first night after she ran, Cleo slept curled beneath the gnarled roots of an ancient oak, its limbs reaching out like skeletal fingers against the inky sky. Her arms were wrapped tight around her knees, a futile attempt to ward off the chilling fear that burrowed deep within her bones. Her thoughts were a roaring tempest, a chaotic symphony of regret and terror that drowned out the gentle twinkle of the stars. They whispered accusations, replayed agonizing moments, and painted vivid nightmares on the canvas of her mind. She didn't shift, didn't dare to unravel the protective cocoon she'd formed. Any movement felt like an invitation for the world to swallow her whole. Didn't cry. The well of tears had run dry, leaving behind only a parched landscape of grief. The pain was too profound, too raw to be expressed in something as simple as tears. It was etched onto her soul, a permanent brand of what she had lost. Just closed her eyes and begged the moon, that silent, unwavering observer, to stop watching her, to grant her the mercy of oblivion, even just for a few hours. It didn't. The moon, cold and impartial, continued its celestial vigil, bathing her in its silvery light, a constant reminder that she was not alone, yet utterly isolated. And when morning came, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and pale orange, her body ached with a bone-deep weariness. Her soul felt hollow, a vast and echoing emptiness where joy and hope had once resided. But her feet, driven by an instinct she couldn't explain, still moved. She walked for miles, putting distance between herself and the wreckage of her past. Each step was a small act of defiance, a refusal to be consumed by the darkness that clung to her. Through thick woods, where the tangled undergrowth clawed at her clothes and the air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The forest was a labyrinth of shadows and secrets, a mirror reflecting the confusion and uncertainty within her. Over back roads, ribbons of cracked asphalt that snaked through the countryside, leading her further into the unknown. The silence was broken only by the crunch of gravel beneath her worn boots and the distant call of unseen birds. Past abandoned cabins, their windows like vacant eyes staring out at a world that had forgotten them. Past deer trails, faint paths worn into the earth by generations of silent creatures, their fleeting presence a reminder of the fragile beauty of the wilderness. The miles blurred into a monotonous rhythm until the pain in her feet dulled to a numb, throbbing ache, and the noise in her head quieted to a crackling static, the echoes of her trauma slowly fading into the background. It took 3 days of relentless walking, fueled by adrenaline and a desperate need for escape, to reach the edge of a town she didn't know existed. A place seemingly erased from the maps, tucked away in a forgotten corner of the world. It wasn't on any map she remembered, from countless hours spent tracing routes and dreaming of escape. This place was different, untouched by the world she knew, and maybe that was the point. Maybe she was meant to discover a place that the world had forgotten. It wasn't big. No towering skyscrapers scraping the sky, no bustling crowds hurrying along the streets. It wasn't grand. No opulent mansions, no manicured gardens, no air of self-importance. But it didn't ask questions. And in her current state, that was the most important thing of all. Understanding eyes would see the pain in her gaze. And Cleo was not ready to share her story. A worn stretch of shops, their paint peeling and their awnings faded, lined the main street. A post office that barely functioned, its mailbox overflowing with forgotten letters. A coffee shop that opened when it felt like it, its hours dictated by the whims of its eccentric owner. A bookstore with a crooked sign and a dusty display window, its shelves overflowing with stories waiting to be discovered. She stopped there first, drawn to the silent promise of solace held within the pages of a book. The place was small, borderline invisible, easily overlooked, a whisper lost in the wind. A main street of aged red brick, worn smooth by decades of footsteps. Faded signage, advertising forgotten businesses, and long-lost dreams. The kind of town where people made eye contact, a brief acknowledgement of shared humanity, but didn't ask questions, respecting the unspoken boundaries of privacy. That suited her just fine. She needed anonymity, a place to disappear, to rebuild herself from the ashes of her former life. She wandered in without a name, a story, or a plan in lee, the ache of a shattered bond and the weight of her silence. She was a ghost haunting her own life, a shell of the person she used to be. She didn't speak when the old man behind the bookstore counter asked if she needed help. Her voice was a rusty hinge, unused and unwilling to form words. Just pointed to a dusty stack of fiction, seeking refuge in the stories of others, hoping to find a flicker of understanding, a glimmer of hope in the fictional worlds they offered. She let her eyes, those windows to her ravaged soul, say everything she couldn't articulate. He didn't push. He saw the haunted look in her eyes, the fragility that clung to her like a shroud, and recognized the need for silence, for space to heal. Later, he introduced himself as Mr. Elsner. Widowed, carrying his quiet grief. Half-deaf, a convenient deafness that allowed him to choose what he heard and what he ignored. Kind, with a gentle spirit that radiated warmth and understanding. She told Mr. Elsner her name was Cleo, a small offering in exchange for his unspoken acceptance. He didn't blink at it, didn't search for recognition, didn't press for a last name, just nodded, his eyes crinkling at the corners, and gave her a spare key to the room above the store. "This town's quiet," he told her once, his voice raspy and low, as if sharing a secret. "But it's got good bones. We don't mind ghosts around here. Just don't let 'em take over." His words resonated with her, a warning and an invitation, a recognition of the darkness she carried, and a plea to not let it consume her. She nodded, understanding the unspoken message. Didn't say how hard that was some nights, when the ghosts of her past clawed at her from the shadows, threatening to drag her back into the abyss. The room above the store was small, barely wide enough for a rickety bed and a wobbly shelf, but it had a window that let in the soft glow of the moonlight, a silent promise of solace, and a door that locked, offering a sense of security, a sanctuary from the world outside. And after everything she had endured, that was more than enough. She paid rent by helping in the store, dusting shelves, arranging books, and occasionally assisting customers with a shy smile. Took on extra hours, burying herself in the work, finding a strange comfort in the order and predictability of the tasks. Kept her head down, avoiding attention, trying to fade into the background, to become just another face in the quiet little town. No one asked where she had come from, or what she was running from or to, or why her eyes never lingered on couples holding hands. The sight, a painful reminder of the intimacy she had lost, the love that had been shattered. They just let her be, respecting her silence, giving her the space to heal at her own pace, without pressure or judgment. Some days, the memories followed her like shadows, lengthening and distorting in the fading light, threatening to engulf her. Others kept their distance, allowing her a brief respite, a moment of peace to catch her breath before the next wave of grief crashed over her. She learned to breathe again, to take shallow, tentative breaths, filling her lungs with air that didn't feel quite so heavy with sorrow. To eat, forcing down small bites of food, nourishing a body that felt foreign and weak. To sleep, finding fleeting moments of oblivion, escaping the nightmares that haunted her waking hours. To stand still without shaking, regaining a sense of equilibrium in a world that had been turned upside down. Not always. There were still days when the pain was overwhelming, when she felt like she was drowning in the wreckage of her past. But there were enough moments of clarity, enough glimpses of hope to keep her moving forward, and in that quiet, something began to settle. The chaos within her started to subside, replaced by a fragile sense of calm. She would stock books in alphabetical order, finding a strange satisfaction in the organization, a way to impose order on the chaos of her own life. Run her fingers across titles she'd never had time to read, imagining the stories contained within, the lives she could escape into. And wonder who she would have been if none of it had happened, if the world hadn't shattered around her. What dreams would she have chased? What love would she have embraced? There were good days, when the sun shone a little brighter, the air smelled a little sweeter, and the weight on her chest felt a little lighter. Days where the ache was dull enough that she could breathe without thinking of him, without the sharp stab of pain that accompanied every memory of his smile, his touch, his betrayal. Then there were days she stood by the window, clutching a warm mug of tea, watching the steam curl into the air like dissipating sorrow, and staring at the vast expanse of the sky, searching for answers in the patterns of the clouds, waiting for the hurt to loosen just a little, to release its grip on her heart, waiting for the day when she could finally forgive herself, and perhaps even forgive him. The town moved slowly, a deliberate, almost languid pace that mirrored the healing process. It wasn't the vibrancy of a city, a place that demanded immediate attention and constant evolution. This was a place where time stretched, allowing wounds to knit shut, leaving behind the pale etchings of scars instead of the raw, bleeding gashes of the present. She liked that slow burn, that quiet hum of normalcy. In its unhurried rhythm, she found solace, a buffer against the whirlwind she'd left behind. She learned the subtle nuances of the town, the secrets whispered in the steam of a morning mug. The bakery, with its yeasty aroma and flour-dusted counters, brewed the best coffee, richer and more comforting than the slick offerings of the cafe. Thursdays were hushed, a mid-week lull before the weekend stirred, and Sundays were even quieter, a day for reflection and the soft rustle of newspapers. She rebuilt herself brick by painstaking brick, piece by quiet piece. It wasn't a grand, imposing structure she was erecting, but a simple, sturdy cottage. a place to weather the storms within. Her intention wasn't to resurrect the ghost of Luna, a title and life she'd shed like a snakeskin. She simply sought to exist, to breathe, without the weight of expectation or obligation. Sometimes, though, she still felt the phantom thread, a faint tug at her soul. The bond she'd severed, the connection that had once defined her. It wasn't pulling, not anymore. Just remembering, a ghost limb, aching for a touch that would never come. Then came the meeting, a ripple in the still pond of her existence. Not a summit, not a ceremony steeped in tradition. Just a scheduled, almost mundane talk between Kodiak and a neighboring alpha, one of the few remaining who hadn't succumbed to suspicion and hostility, about a minor border skirmish and adjustments to trade routes. The lifeblood that kept their packs alive. Cleo didn't know they were coming. The meeting wasn't announced. Her name was not even a thought in the discussion. But the moment she stepped out of the bakery, a precarious stack of books teetering in her arms, her lungs seized up, constricting as if an invisible hand had tightened around her chest. The air thinned, the sounds of the town faded, replaced by the frantic pounding of her heart. She felt him before she saw him, a ripple in the air, a disturbance in the force, an echoing vibration of the bond that she thought she escaped. Nico. He was walking along the opposite sidewalk, oblivious to her presence, a disposable coffee cup clutched in one hand. He was looking down at nothing, lost in thought, his brow furrowed in a way she remembered so well. She froze, a statue carved from ice, her breath hitched, trapped somewhere in her throat. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to vanish back into the anonymity of the bakery, but her feet remained rooted to the spot. He looked up, and the world paused, suspended between breaths. The bustling street, the chirping birds, the aroma of baking bread, all faded into a muted background. He stared. His eyes, the color of deep forest, widened almost imperceptibly. She stared back, her own eyes mirroring his shock. No smiles, no flinches, no easy deflections, just raw, unadulterated recognition. A mirror reflecting a past she thought she'd buried. Grief, shock, relief, regret. All the tangled emotions swirled in the air between them, a visible miasma of unspoken words. For a second, everything she'd built, this new life, this fragile piece, this carefully constructed facade of normalcy, wavered, threatened to crumble under the weight of the past. The cottage she built turned to sand. Then she blinked, breaking the spell. A flicker of resolve hardened her gaze, straightened her shoulders, drawing strength from some ancient well within herself, and walked back toward the bookstore, her footsteps betraying none of the turmoil raging inside. Nico didn't follow. He didn't call out her name. He simply stood there, frozen in his moment of stunned recognition. He didn't need to, because she didn't slam the door behind her, didn't sever the connection with a violent, definitive act. She closed it gently, carefully, and deliberately, like a woman who had nothing to prove, who was no longer defined by the expectations of others or the burdens of the past, like she was in control. She stood in the store for a long while, back pressed against the cool wood of the door, her breath trembling just slightly, the aftershocks of the encounter still reverberating through her. The world hadn't ended. The sun still shone, the town still hummed with life, but it had shifted, subtly, irrevocably. The tectonic plates of her existence had realigned, creating a new landscape of uncertainty and possibility. And for the first time in a long time, Cleo whispered to herself, her voice barely audible above the frantic thumping of her heart, "I'm still here." Kodiak stood at the edge of the small inn's balcony, the ceramic mug of coffee untouched in his hand, growing cold. His gaze was fixed on the quiet, cobblestone street below, tracing the lines of the buildings the way the morning light kissed the rooftops. The breeze, a gentle caress against his face, carried a mosaic of scents. The yeasty sweetness of the bakery down the road, the comforting tang of wood smoke curling from unseen chimneys, and something else, something distant and ethereal that hit his chest like a blade of ice. She was here. He hadn't seen her yet, not with his own eyes, But he didn't have to. He felt it, a primal awareness that hummed beneath his skin, deeper than logic or reason. A pulse in his ribs, a frantic, uneven rhythm that mirrored the anticipation churning inside him. A crackle in the air, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that spoke of potent magic, familiar and yet different. The shift in Nico's entire presence when he came back from his walk the day before, a quiet intensity that had replaced his usual guarded demeanor. Cleo was alive, and close enough to reach out and, what? He didn't know, and choosing not to be seen by him. That was the part that dug deepest, the silent rejection that resonated with the guilt he carried like a lead weight. The worn wooden door creaked open behind him. Nico walked in, already talking, his boots thudding softly on the floorboards. She's okay, working, same place as yesterday. Kodiak didn't turn around, his back still to his beta, his shoulders tense. You saw her again? Briefly, through the window of the shop. Nico's voice was measured, careful. She looked, well, healthier. A pause hung in the air, thick, with unspoken meaning. She saw me too. Kodiak set the mug down on the railing, the ceramic clinking softly against the weathered wood. He finally turned, his face etched with a mixture of hope and apprehension. The sight of Nico, his face unreadable, did little to ease the tempest in his gut. What did she do? The question was clipped, demanding. Nothing dramatic. Just looked at me. Directly. No fear, no hate. Just quiet. Assessing. Nico's eyes met his, holding a gravity that felt both reassuring and terrifying. Kodiak's jaw clenched, the muscle ticking in his cheek. And he needed to know, needed to hear the details, however small, that might give him a glimpse into her state of mind. She nodded, Nico said, his voice low. A small, almost imperceptible movement, then went back to work, attending to a customer. Kodiak dragged a hand through his hair, the dark strands falling across his forehead. Frustration clawed at him. She didn't come to find us. He had perhaps foolishly clung to the hope that seeing him, knowing he was alive and nearby, would be enough to draw her out. She didn't run either. Nico pointed out a subtle reminder that things could be worse. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the distant sounds of the town waking up. It was a silence filled with unspoken questions, with the weight of their shared history, and the chasm that now separated them. Then Kodiak asked the question he hadn't dared say aloud since they got here, the question that had haunted his waking hours and invaded his dreams, threatening to unravel the last vestiges of his control. Does she look okay? The words were a raw whisper, torn from his throat. Nico hesitated, his gaze flickering away, as if searching for the right words, the right way to deliver the truth. The hesitation alone was an answer in itself. She looks like someone who's trying to be. That hurt more than he expected. Somehow, worse than if Nico had said yes, she affirmed that she had moved on completely. The idea of her struggling, of forcing a smile while the pain still lingered, was almost unbearable. She looked at peace, Kodiak, Nico added, his voice softening slightly. Not fully there, but close, like she's learning how to live without the constant ache, the constant worry. Kodiak exhaled, a ragged breath that did little to ease the tightness in his chest. His eyes narrowed, focusing on a distant point beyond the rooftops, trying to reconcile the image Nico painted with the Cleo he remembered. Without me, you mean? The words were laced with bitterness, a self-inflicted wound. Don't make this about your ego, Nico warned, his voice sharp. This isn't about you. It's not ego, Kodiak snapped, his defenses rising instantly. It's regret. It's the knowledge that I'm the one who put her in this position. He sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, the springs groaning beneath his weight. He rested his elbows on his knees, his head bowed, his gaze fixed on the worn floorboards. I thought she'd be broken, he admitted, the confession a harsh rasp. He had prepared himself for a shattered version of the woman he loved, a victim of the circumstances he had created. You thought she'd still be yours, Nico corrected, his tone unwavering. Kodiak looked up, his eyes sharp and dangerous. "That's not fair." "No," Nico said, his expression unwavering. "It's honest. And maybe honesty is what you need right now." Kodiak leaned back, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing, replaying the events that had led them here. "You ever make a mistake so big it just echoes?" he asked quietly, his voice barely a whisper. "Like you hear it every damn time you close your eyes? Like it's a constant reminder of how badly you screwed up." Nico folded his arms, his stance suggesting a weary patience. "Every wolf has regrets, Kodiak. Every leader carries the weight of their decisions. But most of them don't throw away their Luna, their bondmate, and expect forgiveness to follow them. I don't expect forgiveness." The words were flat, devoid of emotion. He knew he didn't deserve it. "Good," Nico said, his voice firm. "Because she doesn't owe you any. You broke a sacred bond. You hurt her deeply. And the path to earning back her trust, if that's even possible, is going to be long and arduous." Kodiak stood and started pacing, his long strides eating up the small space. The restlessness in his soul mirrored the turmoil in his mind. I thought if she saw me again, maybe—" "No," Nico interrupted, cutting him off before he could give voice to his wishful thinking. "You don't get to hope she comes back. You get to work for it. You get to prove that you're worthy of her forgiveness, of a second chance. And even then, after all that effort, she might still walk away. She has every right," Kodiak said, his voice flat, resigned. Nico nodded, his gaze unwavering. "She does, and you need to be prepared for that. You need to accept that you may have lost her for good." Kodiak finally stopped pacing, his broad frame still radiating restless energy. He stood rigid, staring out the window of the hotel room, the small town blurring into an indistinguishable mass of flickering lights and shadows. The weight of his regret seemed to physically bow his shoulders. "She was the strongest wolf I've ever known," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that barely carried across the room. The statement hung in the air, heavy with unacknowledged truths. "And I made her feel like she was disposable." The confession was a raw, exposed nerve, a testament to the damage he had inflicted. Nico leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, his expression a careful mask of observation. He had been silent for a long time, allowing Kodiak to unravel on his own. Now, he spoke, each word measured and precise. "You didn't just break her, Kodiak. You broke us, the pack." Everyone felt that silence when she left. It was like a vital organ had been removed. "You think she was just the Luna in name? She was the soul of that house, the glue that held us together." There was no accusation in his tone, only a stark, unflinching assessment of the consequences. Kodiak's shoulders dropped further, the fight seeming to drain out of him. "I know." The word was a defeated exhale. Nico pushed off the doorframe, stepping further into the room. "No, you feel it," Nico corrected, his gaze piercing. "But you don't know it. Not yet. Because if you did, you wouldn't be standing here hoping for a reunion. You'd be asking how to start over without dragging her down again. You'd be willing to sacrifice your desires for her well-being." A heavy silence passed between them, thick with unspoken emotions and painful realizations. The only sound was the distant hum of the city, a stark contrast to the turmoil raging within Kodiak. Then, his voice barely a whisper, Kodiak asked, "So what do I do?" He looked at Nico, a flicker of desperate hope in his eyes. Nico shrugged, a seemingly indifferent gesture that belied the gravity of the situation. "Nothing. For now." "Nothing?" Kodiak's voice rose slightly, tinged with incredulity. He craved action, a way to fix what he had broken. "Yeah," Nico said, his gaze unwavering. "Let her be. Let her breathe without the shadow of you showing up, constantly reminding her of the pain. She's not hiding, Kodiak. She's choosing. There's a difference. She's actively deciding what she wants, and you need to respect that." Kodiak sank back down onto the edge of the worn armchair, staring into the empty mug on the table. The chipped ceramic seemed to mock him with its emptiness, reflecting the void he had created in his own life. "I hate this," he muttered, the words laced with frustration and a dawning understanding of the magnitude of his mistakes. "Good," Nico said, a hint of something akin to relief in his voice. Means you're starting to understand what she carried. The burden of leadership, the expectations of the pack, the pressure of being your Luna. You're finally feeling a fraction of what she endured. Later that night, under the cloak of darkness, Kodiak stood alone outside the bookstore. The building was a quiet sanctuary, bathed in the soft glow of a distant streetlight. Lights off, curtains drawn, street silent. The bookstore was closed for the night, its secrets hidden within its walls. He didn't approach the door, didn't knock, didn't risk disturbing the fragile peace within. Just stood there, a silent sentinel, watching the window he guessed was hers, the one that offered a glimpse into her private world. He imagined her there, surrounded by books, finding solace in their stories. And when the wind shifted, a gentle caress against his face, bringing the faintest trace of her scent, a delicate blend of wildflowers and old paper, he closed his eyes. The scent was a phantom limb, a reminder of what he had lost. He didn't call her name, didn't dare break the silence with his voice, didn't beg the moon to fix it, didn't plead for a second chance. Just whispered, a silent promise carried on the wind, "I see you." And then, with a heavy heart, he turned and left. Back inside the inn, Nico was waiting, his presence a steady anchor in the maelstrom of Kodiak's emotions. "Well?" he asked, his voice neutral, betraying nothing of his thoughts. Kodiak sat down quietly on the edge of the bed, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion. "I didn't go in." Nico raised a brow, a silent question hanging in the air. "She deserves space," Kodiak said, his voice barely audible. "To heal, to rebuild. So I gave it." For the first time in a year, Nico nodded, a slow, deliberate movement of his head. The gesture was small, but it held a world of significance, and said simply, "Good." The word was a balm, a small measure of hope in the face of overwhelming despair. It was a beginning. The sky was wrong. Cleo stood at the bookstore window, mug warm in her hands, eyes fixed on the moon. The aroma of cinnamon and old paper usually calmed her, but tonight a prickling unease ran beneath her skin. It glowed blue, not metaphorically, literally. An unearthly, cold, shimmering silver-blue cast stretched across the rooftops of Havenwood and dusted the brick road like an ethereal frost. It painted the world in shades she'd never imagined. It was the kind of moon you didn't see twice in your life, the kind you didn't forget, burning itself into the back of your mind like a brand, and something inside her stirred. A deep, resonant chord within her soul vibrated in response. Old magic, comforting, yet unsettling. A familiar warmth chased away the usual chill of the autumn air, wrapping around her like a forgotten memory. The scent of pine needles and damp earth suddenly filled her senses, overwhelming the scent of her tea. In the inn, Nico sat at the edge of the bed, staring out the same window. The blue light illuminated his sharp features, highlighting the worry etched on his face. He tapped a nervous rhythm against his thigh. Kodiak stood near the dresser, lacing his boots with the kind of deliberate focus that meant his mind was somewhere else entirely, somewhere far away and grappling with something heavy. He tightened the laces, his knuckles white, his gaze fixed on the floor. "You feel it too, huh?" Nico said quietly, his voice barely a whisper against the thick silence that had descended upon the room. Kodiak didn't answer. He didn't have to. The unspoken agreement hung heavy in the air between them. He knew. Nico knew. They all felt it. The energy in the air buzzed, a tangible hum that vibrated through the floorboards and tingled on the skin. Not violent, not a threat. At least, not yet. Not chaotic. Not like the wild, unpredictable surges they'd encountered before. Just pulling and urging, a gentle, insistent tugging on something deep within them, guiding them towards an unknown destination. Nico's voice broke the silence, laced with a strange mixture of awe and apprehension. "Blue moon. I haven't seen one since I was a kid." Kodiak looked up, jaw tight, his eyes narrowed with a grim understanding. "This isn't just a moon. No, it's a shift," Nico confirmed, his voice dropping to a low murmur. "A sign?" Kodiak asked, his hope warring with a deep-seated skepticism. Nico shook his head. his gaze locking onto Kodiak's. A door, and it's only gonna open once. The certainty in his voice was absolute. Cleo didn't know why she left the bookstore. The logical part of her brain screamed for her to stay inside, to analyze the phenomenon, to understand. But the pull was too strong to resist. She didn't lock the door. A careless oversight, or perhaps a subconscious invitation. Didn't think to bring a jacket. The cold didn't seem to bother her. The strange warmth radiating from within kept the chill at bay. She just stepped out barefoot, the cold brick a surprising comfort against her skin, and followed the quiet pull down the street. Each step felt deliberate, guided by an invisible force. The town was asleep. Lights low in the windows of the old houses, casting long, distorted shadows. Not a single sound but the faint whisper of wind between brick buildings, a mournful song carried on the night air. The silver-blue light amplified the silence, lending an eerie quality to the familiar streets. And at the center of it, the source of the pull, the locus of the burgeoning magic. The old garden behind the bakery, a place she hadn't thought about in a while. Small, quiet, forgotten by time, overgrown with ivy and wildflowers. A single wrought iron bench sat beneath the open sky, bathed in the ethereal moonlight. She didn't think, she just sat. She sank onto the cold metal, the blue light washing over her, enveloping her in its strange embrace. A sense of peace settled over her, a quiet understanding that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Kodiak didn't speak as they reached the town square. The normally bustling heart of Havenwood was deserted, the shop windows dark and lifeless. He slowed, stopped. His senses were heightened, every nerve ending screaming. He could feel her, a beacon in the night. Nico glanced over, his expression unreadable. "You know where she is, don't you?" Kodiak nodded once, the movement stiff and reluctant. "I can feel her." The connection between them was undeniable, a constant hum beneath the surface of his awareness. "You gonna go?" Nico asked, his voice carefully neutral. Kodiak's hands curled into fists at his sides. Months of guilt and self-reproach weighed heavily on him. "Do I deserve to?" Nico looked him dead in the eye, his gaze unwavering. He saw the pain, the doubt, the yearning. "No, but she deserves it." Cleo didn't hear his footsteps. She just felt them. Felt the weight of him enter the garden like gravity had changed its mind, as if the very earth recognized his presence and shifted accordingly. The scent of pine and something wild, untamed, drifted on the night air, a familiar fragrance that stirred long-dormant memories. She remained still, a statue carved from moonlight and shadow, her gaze fixed on a wilting rosebush. She didn't look up, not right away. She allowed the tension to build, the anticipation to coil tight within her chest, a strange mix of dread and something akin to hope. Each second stretched into an eternity, a silent battle waged within her soul. The night around her hummed with unspoken words, with the ghosts of promises and betrayals. Then, Kodiak. His name left her lips calm and sharp, a honed blade slicing through the heavy atmosphere. It was a statement, not a question, an acknowledgement of his presence, but also a declaration of her own, not broken, not trembling, just truth, raw, unadulterated, undeniable truth. It resonated in the quiet garden, a single note of clarity in a symphony of confusion. He stepped closer, the sound of his leather boots on the stone path, a measured rhythm against the backdrop of crickets chirping. He didn't sit, didn't presume to encroach on her space, leaving a tangible distance between them, like it was sacred ground, a boundary etched in regret and unspoken pain. "I didn't know you'd be here," he said quietly, his voice a low rumble that resonated with a hint of vulnerability. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the surrounding trees, as if nature itself held its breath, waiting. "I didn't know you were still capable of listening to the moon." Her words were laced with a subtle venom, a sting of accusation that hung in the air. She didn't turn, but she could feel his surprise, his discomfort, like a physical weight pressing down on the garden. That hit like a slap, but he didn't flinch. He absorbed the blow, his silence a testament to the truth in her words, the weight of his past actions, The consequences of his choices were etched on his face. "I never stopped listening," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just stopped deserving answers." He closed the distance between them slightly, a subtle shift that telegraphed a need to be closer, to bridge the chasm that had grown between them. Cleo finally turned towards him, her emerald eyes catching his, the moonlight reflecting in their depths like fractured shards of glass. All the anger, all the hurt, all the confusion she'd kept locked away now surged to the surface. She studied him, searching for any sign of deceit, any flicker of the man she once knew. The silence between them pressed in from every side, thick and suffocating, a palpable entity that threatened to consume them both. The weight of their shared history, the memories of love and betrayal, hung heavy in the air. And the moon above, glowing that strange pale blue, seemed to hold its breath, bathing the garden in an ethereal, almost unearthly light, a silent witness to their fragile encounter. Kodiak lowered himself onto the edge of the bench, leaving space between them like it was sacred, a no-man's land separating two warring factions. The gesture was deliberate, a silent acknowledgement of the pain he had inflicted, a demonstration of his newfound respect for her boundaries. "You look well," he said, his gaze lingering on her face, taking in every detail, as if he were memorizing her anew. He saw the strength in her jaw, the resilience in her eyes, the quiet power that radiated from her very being. "I am." Her response was curt, defiant, a clear signal that she would not be swayed by empty platitudes. She held his gaze, unflinching, challenging him to see the truth in her words. Another pause. The only sound was the gentle chirping of crickets, a stark contrast to the turmoil raging within them both. "You look strong." His voice was softer now, laced with a hint of admiration. He recognized the changes within her, the scars she carried, the unwavering spirit that had refused to be broken. "I am." This time, there was a hint of pride in her voice, a quiet acknowledgement of her strength and resilience. She had survived. She had rebuilt. She had become someone new, forged in the fires of betrayal and loss. He nodded slowly, hands clasped together, knuckles white with tension. He seemed smaller somehow, less imposing, his usual arrogance replaced by a quiet humility. "I'm not here to make this about me," he said, his voice laced with sincerity. "I just needed to say something while the moon allowed it." He glanced up at the sky, a subtle acknowledgement of the ancient magic that bound them, the forces that had drawn them together, and now compelled them to speak. She looked at him fully now, truly seeing him for the first time, in a long time, not cold, not cruel, but clear. He was stripped bare, vulnerable, his defenses down. The bravado he once wore like armor was gone, replaced by a raw honesty that surprised her. "Then say it." She braced herself, steeling her resolve, unsure of what was to come but determined to face it head-on. He took a breath, a visible effort to compose himself, to choose his words carefully. The air crackled with unspoken tension, the anticipation almost unbearable. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Cleo." The words were simple, but the weight behind them was immense. They hung in the air, heavy with regret, with remorse, with the burden of his past mistakes. The words didn't rush, didn't crack. They landed. Each syllable struck her like a physical blow, reopening old wounds, stirring up forgotten pain. For not fighting harder, for choosing wrong, for letting something sacred become something disposable and dirty. His voice was thick with emotion. The words wrung from the depths of his soul. He confessed his sins, laying bare his regrets, offering her the truth he had so long suppressed. She said nothing. She simply watched him, her expression unreadable, allowing him to unravel before her. So he kept going, driven by a desperate need to make her understand, to atone for his past mistakes. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just needed you to know. I see it now. I see you. All of it. Everything you were, to the pack, to me, to yourself." He finally met her gaze, his eyes filled with a profound sorrow, a deep understanding of the magnitude of his loss. He saw the strength she possessed, the loyalty she embodied, the person he had so carelessly thrown away. Cleo looked back at the sky, her face bathed in the eerie blue light of the moon. "It took a blue moon to get you to see that." The sarcasm was evident in her voice, a bitter reminder of his blindness, his prolonged ignorance. "No," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "It took losing you." The words hung in the air, raw and honest, a testament to the devastating impact of his choices. They sat in silence again, the weight of their unspoken emotions pressing down on them. The air was thick with regret, with longing, with the lingering echoes of what might have been. Then, "I still wake up angry," she said, her voice soft but firm. She broke the silence, exposing the lingering wounds, the scars that still haunted her. "You should." His response was immediate, unwavering. He didn't try to dismiss her anger, to minimize her pain. He validated it, acknowledging the depth of her suffering. "I still can't walk into a room without looking for an exit." Her confession was a fragile thread, a glimpse into the anxiety that still plagued her, the fear that lingered in the shadows of her mind. "I hate that I did that to you." His voice was filled with genuine remorse, a profound understanding of the damage he had inflicted. He carried the weight of her fear, the burden of her lost sense of security. "I hate that you let me believe I was safe, and then proved I wasn't." Her voice trembled slightly, betraying the depth of her pain, the profound sense of betrayal that still lingered. He had shattered her trust, her innocence, her belief in the safety of their bond. His voice dropped, barely audible. "Me too." The two words were a universe of regret, a silent acknowledgement of the profound damage he had caused. Another moment passed, stretching into an eternity. The moon seemed to pulse with an ancient energy, casting long, eerie shadows across the garden. The night air moved gently around them, the light from above turning her skin silver and his eyes darker, reflecting the depths of their souls. The stillness was broken only by the rustling of leaves and the distant hooting of an owl, a haunting melody that mirrored the ache in their hearts. Then Cleo whispered, her voice barely audible, "Do you know what this moon means?" Her question hung in the air, laden with significance, a subtle hint of the possibility of something more. Kodiak shook his head, his brow furrowed in confusion. He was lost in the moment, overwhelmed by the weight of his regrets, and oblivious to the deeper meaning hidden within the celestial event. "It's the moon's reminder," she said, her voice filled with a quiet reverence, "of everything rare, everything that shouldn't happen but does." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and trepidation, hinting at the possibility of a second chance, a chance to rewrite their story. "Like us crossing paths again?" he ventured, his voice hesitant, unsure of where this was leading. He clung to the hope that their meeting was not a mere coincidence, but a sign of something more, a glimmer of redemption. "No," she said softly, her gaze unwavering. "Like second chances that don't come easy." Her words were a challenge, a warning that the path ahead would be fraught with difficulties, that rebuilding their trust would be a long and arduous process. He stood slowly, his movements deliberate, unsure of what to say next. The weight of her words settled on him, the realization that forgiveness would not be freely given, that he would have to earn it, one step at a time. But Cleo looked up at him, her eyes filled with a complex mixture of emotions, and said, "I didn't ask you to leave." The words were unexpected, a glimmer of hope in the darkness, a subtle invitation to stay. He froze, his body rigid with surprise, his mind reeling from the unexpected turn of events. He had expected anger, rejection, but not this hesitant invitation. "I didn't ask you to stay either," she added, her voice laced with a subtle warning. She tempered her invitation with a dose of realism, a reminder that rebuilding their relationship would require effort from both of them, that she would not make it easy for him. He met her eyes, sensing the unspoken vulnerability beneath her guarded exterior. He saw the flicker of hope, the deep-seated longing, the desire to believe in him again. "I will, if you want me to." His voice was filled with unwavering resolve, a promise to stay, to fight for her, to earn her forgiveness. He was willing to do whatever it took to rebuild their trust, to reclaim the love they had lost. Cleo didn't answer right away. She searched his eyes, looking for any sign of deceit, any hint of the man who had betrayed her. She needed to be sure, to protect herself from further hurt. Then, not yet. The two words were a compromise, a mixture of hope and caution, an acknowledgement of his sincerity, but also a refusal to rush into things. She needed time, space, to heal, to rebuild her trust, and that was enough. For now, it was enough. He understood her need for time, her reluctance to fully embrace him. He would be patient, persistent, willing to wait for her to heal. As he turned to walk away, leaving her alone in the moonlit garden, she whispered one last thing under the weight of the moonlight. "I don't know what we are anymore." Her voice was filled with uncertainty, a reflection of the confusion and turmoil that still plagued her. They were no longer what they once were, but the possibility of something new, something different, hung in the air. Kodiak stopped, his shoulders slumped with a mixture of relief and trepidation. He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes searching hers, seeking guidance, seeking reassurance. "Neither do I," he admitted, his voice soft but honest. He was just as lost as she was, uncertain of the path ahead, but willing to face it with her. "But I want to find out." Cleo's words hung in the air, a fragile seed of hope planted in the fertile ground of their shared history. The journey would be long and difficult, but the possibility of rediscovering their connection, of forging something new and stronger, was enough to keep them both moving forward. Cleo didn't sleep the night of the blue moon. Rest felt like a betrayal, a luxury she hadn't earned. The weight of the past few months pressed down on her, demanding vigilance. So she sat vigil, a solitary sentinel, guarding the fragile peace she'd tentatively claimed. She sat by the window, a fortress of blankets wrapped around her shoulders, legs tucked beneath her, and stared up at the sky like it might offer answers she didn't ask for out loud. The blue light bathed her face in an ethereal glow, highlighting the shadows beneath her eyes, the subtle tremor in her lips. She searched the celestial canvas for meaning, for guidance, but found only the silent, indifferent beauty of the cosmos. She didn't cry. Tears felt too easy, too cleansing. She didn't deserve release. She didn't rage. Fury had been her constant companion, a burning ember in her chest. But tonight, the fire was banked, reduced to a low, simmering heat. It was a start. She just breathed. Inhale, exhale. A simple, primal act that anchored her to the present. A reminder that she was still here, still capable of drawing breath. For the first time in months, she could breathe, truly breathe, without the crushing weight of guilt and resentment constricting her lungs. The air still tasted of ash, of regret, but it was no longer toxic. Kodiak had found her. After all this time, after all that had happened. He'd sat beside her, not in a demanding posture, but with respect. And he hadn't begged for forgiveness, hadn't demanded her understanding. He'd owned it. Every agonizing, terrible decision, every mistake, every moment of weakness. He didn't excuse anything, only offered the truth, and she'd listened. She hadn't spoken, hadn't interrupted, just absorbed his words like a parched plant drinks in water. She didn't forgive him. Not yet, maybe not ever. The wounds were too deep, the scars too raw, but she hadn't walked away either. She had stayed, held captive by a fragile hope, by the faintest glimmer of something that might, one day, resemble trust, and that was enough for now. A tentative truce in a war that had raged for far too long. The bookstore was still warm with the scent of ink, and old Pagacia familiar sanctuary. The morning light filtering through the windows was soft, painting the shelves in hues of gold and amber. The usual ache in her chest, the constant knot of anxiety, had dulled to something quiet and manageable, a dull throb rather than a sharp stab. Cleo moved through the shelves slowly, mindlessly, shelving volumes of poetry and crumbling history books. The physical act of organizing, of bringing order to chaos, was soothing, a small act of control, in a world that felt increasingly out of her grasp. She didn't flinch when the doorbell chimed, announcing a visitor. She simply straightened, took a deep breath, and prepared herself for whatever the morning might bring. Nico stepped inside, hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets, expression unreadable as always. His face was a carefully constructed mask. But there was a tightness around his eyes, a weight he hadn't carried the last time he'd been here. Something was different. Something had shifted. Cleo nodded to him, brushing her hands against her jeans, trying to smooth away any lingering traces of the night's unrest. Morning. Her voice was low, a little raspy from disuse. Nico walked to the counter and leaned against it, like he had a dozen times before, a casual pose that belied the tension radiating from him. But this time, he didn't offer coffee. No light-hearted small talk. The usual pleasantries were absent, replaced by a grave seriousness that prickled at Cleo's senses. Just this. The council shunned her. Not long after you left. Cleo stilled, every muscle in her body locking in place. The air in the bookstore seemed to thicken, each breath becoming a monumental effort. Her carefully constructed composure threatened to crumble. He let it hang there a second, savoring the moment, before adding, "It happened fast. They didn't even debate it." Everyone felt what it cost. The words were clipped, devoid of emotion, but Cleo could hear the underlying satisfaction, the vindication. She stayed quiet, afraid to speak, afraid of what she might say, afraid of what it all meant. Nico glanced at the floor, then back up, his gaze unwavering. "I thought you should know. A lot went down after you left. That was one of the first things." Still, she didn't speak. The information was a blow, a release, a confirmation all rolled into one. It was what she'd wanted, what she thought she deserved. So why wasn't she happy? But her shoulders eased just slightly, the almost imperceptible shift offering a silent acknowledgement. A fragile weight lifted from her soul, and that was all he needed. A subtle confirmation that his message had been received, that it had made a difference. She stepped around the worn wooden counter, the familiar creak, a small comfort in the sea of unease swirling inside her. She moved to the front window, resting her hand lightly on the cool glass. Outside, the small town was draped in its usual morning calm. The same bakery across the street, promising the scent of cinnamon and sugar that would soon drift on the breeze. The same leaning lamppost on the corner, perpetually buzzing with a faint electrical hum when the wind caught it just right. Things that always were. But everything inside her had fractured, shifted, rearranged itself into something she barely recognized. The world outside might be holding steady, but her landscape had been irrevocably altered. "That night," she said softly, her voice barely louder than the whir of the refrigerator behind her, "I thought it would break the whole world." Nico's voice, low and laced with a quiet understanding, came from behind her. "It did. For us, it did." Cleo turned to face him, crossing her arms lightly over her chest, a defensive posture she hadn't even realized she'd adopted. And now? The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken anxieties and fragile hope. "We're still figuring it out," Nico said, his gaze steady and frank. "The pack's quieter, less sure. Kodiak, he's not what he was." A shadow flickered across his face as he spoke his alpha's name. "I'm not either," Cleo replied, her voice laced with a hint of bitterness. The admission felt like a weight lifted, if only slightly. Nico nodded slowly, his eyes searching hers. "Maybe that's a good thing." The words were tentative, a fragile offering of optimism. He didn't say more, didn't try to fill the silence with empty platitudes. Instead, he stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and wrapped his arms around her in a soft, solid hug. No pressure, no demands, no expectation, just warmth. A simple, grounding presence. It caught her off guard, the way his arms anchored around her, not like a beta, tasked with protecting his alpha, not like a soldier, following orders without question, but like Pac, like the brother she'd lost in the devastating fallout of the bond breaking. The sibling-like connection was severed by the nightmarish events. And maybe, just maybe, a brother she'd found again in the ruins. She didn't tense, didn't recoil from the unexpected contact. For the first time, in what felt like an eternity, her body didn't scream for her to run, to protect herself. didn't pull away. She leaned in, just enough to acknowledge the embrace, to accept the silent offering, and, for a brief, quiet moment, cradled in the simple act of human connection, it didn't feel like survival anymore. The constant, gnawing anxiety that had become her baseline receded, replaced by something softer, something gentler. It felt like home, a word that had become foreign, a concept she'd almost forgotten existed. He pulled away, leaving a lingering warmth in his wake. They stood for a moment, the silence comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding. Then Cleo asked, the question a small, hesitant offering, "How is he today?" Nico's lips twitched, not quite a smile, but a flicker of amusement mixed with concern. "Careful? And restless. He hasn't been sleeping much. The dreams, I think last night gave him something he didn't know how to hold. Something he's unsure if he even deserves." Cleo looked back out the window, her gaze fixed on the mundane normalcy of Havenwood, a stark contrast to the turmoil within her. "I know the feeling." The weight of that shared burden settled between them. Nico turned toward the door, ready to leave her with her thoughts, but paused, his hand on the handle. "If you ever want to come by, we are still at the inn," he said, his voice low and sincere. "He won't expect anything, but he'll wait, as long as it takes." "I don't know what I want," Cleo admitted, the words raw and honest. The uncertainty was a heavy cloak, smothering any sense of direction. "You don't have to. Not yet." He offered a small, reassuring smile. "Just know that the offer's there." After Nico left, the silence of the shop seemed to press in on her. Cleo sank onto the stool behind the counter, the worn leather cool beneath her. She cradled her cooling tea in her hands, staring at the quiet hum of the shop around her, the gentle whir of the refrigerator, the soft tick of the grandfather clock in the corner, the comforting scent of old books and brewing herbs. She wasn't okay, not even close, not fully healed, not entirely whole. But something had cracked open last night, a fissure in the wall she'd built around her heart. And maybe, just maybe, the fragile, tentative beginning of something better had slipped through the opening. A sliver of hope, a glimmer of possibility in the darkness. That night, beneath a now pale white moon that cast long, eerie shadows across the town, Cleo whispered to herself the words, "A prayer and a promise, one day." But not yet. And for the first time since the bond broke, the lie she had been living, the facade of strength she had presented to the world, she didn't feel like she was lying. Not entirely. There was a flicker of truth in her voice, a fragile seed of hope planted in the barren landscape of her heart, and perhaps, with time and care, it might just bloom. The nights had grown longer since the blue moon, or maybe they just felt longer, each one stretching into an eternity of quiet contemplation and gnawing uncertainty. Kodiak stood at the edge of the small clearing behind the inn, the familiar scent of pine and damp earth doing little to soothe the turmoil within him. He stared up at the place where the moon used to hang bright, blue, impossible, a celestial anomaly that had mirrored the impossible hope blooming in his own chest. Now it was just white again, pale, quiet, ordinary. And everything since then had been quiet too, an oppressive silence that echoed the hollowness in his soul. Cleo hadn't come looking for him, hadn't written a single word, not even a curt dismissal, hadn't so much as passed near the inn, as if he were a ghost she was actively avoiding. The silence was deafening, a stark contrast to the vibrant energy that had crackled between them. And still, he waited, a fool clinging to a fading ember of hope. Every day, he'd find some excuse to be outside, his eyes scanning the horizon, his ears straining for the sound of her voice, the rumble of her approaching vehicle. Each day, the hope dwindled a little more. He sat on the floor now instead of the bed, finding a perverse comfort in the physical strain, did push-ups until his arms burned, each repetition a silent penance for his past mistakes. Tried to meditate, to find some inner peace amidst the chaos in his mind, and always failed. His thoughts were a relentless storm of longing and regret. Nico walked in mid-morning with 2 mugs of coffee, the aroma filling the small room. He dropped into the rickety chair with a familiar grunt, his presence a grounding force in Kodiak's spiraling world. "You look like hell," Nico stated bluntly, his voice devoid of sympathy. "Thanks," Kodiak muttered, his gaze fixed on the worn floorboards. He couldn't meet Nico's eyes. "You eating?" Enough. A lie. He'd lost his appetite. The joy of food replaced by a constant knot of anxiety in his stomach. "You sleeping?" "Barely." Another lie, only slightly less egregious. He'd toss and turn for hours, haunted by dreams of Cleo, only to wake up to the same crushing reality. "Thinking about going to see her?" Nico's voice was carefully neutral. Kodiak paused, the muscles in his jaw clenching. Every minute. The confession was a raw, painful admission of his weakness. Nico nodded, his expression unreadable. "Good. That means you won't." Kodiak finally looked up, his eyes narrowed, a flicker of anger igniting within him. "You're enjoying this whole moral compass thing, huh?" "I'm enjoying not having to stop you from screwing it up again," Nico retorted, his tone firm. "You've been given a second chance, Kodiak. Don't waste it." They sat in silence for a while, the unspoken tension thick in the air. Nico sipped his coffee, the rhythmic gulping amplifying the quiet. Kodiak stared at the window, his reflection staring back at him, a grim reminder of his failings. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken words and unresolved emotions. "She talked to me," Nico said, breaking the quiet. That got his attention. Kodiak's head snapped up, his heart lurching in his chest. "When?" he demanded, his voice rough with anticipation. "Yesterday." "Where?" "The bookstore. I stopped by to pick up some supplies." He deliberately kept his tone casual, but Kodiak could sense the underlying significance. Kodiak sat straighter, his muscles tensing. "How was she?" Nico studied him, his gaze assessing. He seemed to be carefully choosing his words. "Better. Not fine, but better. She's coping." "And?" Kodiak pressed, desperate for any scrap of information. "And she asked about you." Kodiak's throat tightened, constricting his breath. He swallowed hard, trying to regain control of his voice. "What did you say?" "I told her the truth as I saw it, that you're different, that you're trying to be better, that you're lost." Nico's gaze softened, a hint of compassion in his eyes. Kodiak looked away, unable to bear the weight of Nico's scrutiny. He felt exposed, his vulnerabilities laid bare. "And then I hugged her." That made him pause, the possessive instinct rising within him, quickly suppressed. "You hugged her?" "Yeah," Nico said softly, his voice laced with understanding. "Because she needed someone to remind her she still has us. She's not just your Luna, Kodiak. She was our anchor long before you came along." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "Don't forget." An hour or so later, the silence in the room had thickened, heavy with unspoken regret and lingering hope. Kodiak, restless and trapped by his memories, stood and walked to the window. The glass was cool against his forehead as he gazed out at the darkening cityscape, jaw clenched in a silent battle against the emotions churning within him. "I see her sometimes." "In my head," he said quietly, his voice barely a whisper that seemed to catch on the rising wind outside. "In the garden, tending to her herbs, her hands covered in dirt. In the kitchen, humming off-key as she experimented with new recipes, flour dusting her apron. In bed, with her feet cold under the blankets, always trying to steal my warmth." He gave a dry, humorless laugh, a sound that spoke volumes of the pain he held within. "She used to complain that I snored like a dying bear," said the whole house rattled. "She did," Nico said with a smirk, the corner of his mouth tilting upwards in a familiar brotherly way. "And she wasn't wrong. I heard you from across the hall a few times." They both chuckled, a brief moment of levity that allowed them to breathe, to remember the good times before everything had fallen apart. But the laughter faded fast, the weight of the present crashing back down on them like a tidal wave. "I ruined it," Kodiak said, the statement stark and devoid of self-pity, just a simple, brutal truth. All of it. Every single beautiful thing we had. Nico reached across the small table between them and clapped Kodiak on the shoulder. "No," he replied, his voice firm and steady. You shattered it, broke it into a million pieces. But she's the one who picked up the pieces and kept going. She rebuilt her life, her happiness. That's the part that matters. Kodiak. That's the part you need to remember. Kodiak's voice dropped, laced with a vulnerability Nico rarely heard. Do you think she'll ever let me try again? Let me help her build something new. Nico sighed, a sound that conveyed both understanding and caution. I think she'll decide that on her own time. And if you care at all, if you truly love her, you'll respect that time. You'll give her the space she needs to heal and to choose. I do, Kodiak said, the words a solemn vow. Then keep waiting. Keep working on yourself. Keep proving that you're capable of being the man she deserves. And, for the love of the moon, don't knock on her door just because you miss her. Don't pressure her. Don't be selfish. Kodiak didn't argue. He knew Nico was right. Every word was a painful, necessary medicine. He had no right to demand anything from her after what he had done. That night, he left the inn alone, the weight of Nico's words settling heavily in his chest. He had no destination in mind, no particular reason to walk. He just needed to move, to outpace the ghosts that haunted his thoughts. The streets were dim, lit by the pale glow of street lamps that cast long, distorted shadows. The wind was sharp, a biting reminder of the coldness he had brought into Cleo's life. He passed the edge of the bookstore, just as the lights inside clicked off, plunging the building into darkness. His heart stuttered, a painful reminder of the life he longed for, the life he might never have again. His feet instinctively wanted to turn, to cross the street, to beg for a glimpse of her face. But he didn't stop. He just kept walking, hands shoved deep into his pockets, head down, shoulders slumped in defeat. He would respect her space, even if it killed him. From the upstairs window, shrouded in the darkness of her apartment, Cleo watched him go. She hadn't meant to. She wasn't waiting for him. Not consciously. She had just finished closing up the shop. The familiar routine, a small comfort in the face of her own turbulent emotions. But she saw him, recognized the familiar silhouette against the streetlights. Noted the way he walked slower now, the confident stride replaced by a hesitant shuffle. His shoulders were less squared, carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. He was less alpha, less the powerful leader she had once known, and more, just a man burdened by regret. She didn't wave, didn't open the window to call out his name, though the impulse was a sharp, almost unbearable ache in her chest. But she whispered under her breath, her voice barely audible even to herself, I see you, too, Kodiak. And that was enough. Enough to know he was still there, still fighting. Enough to fuel the faintest flicker of hope that perhaps, someday, things might be different. Perhaps, someday, they might both find their way back to the light. The fire started small, a flicker behind the old fuse box. The bookstore had always been too old, too dry. One frayed wire, a silent spark dancing in the shadows. And suddenly, the comforting scent of ink and aging paper morphed into a choking cloud of smoke and oppressive heat. Cleo was alone. She'd stayed late, driven by a need to organize the new shipment, humming a tuneless melody as she meticulously shelved hardcovers on the upper floor. It was a soothing ritual, a way to unwind after a long day of dealing with customers. She didn't hear the first crackle of flame, the whisper of fire finding purchase, but she smelled it. Burning insulation, a sharp, acrid tang that cut through the familiar bookish aroma. Smoke, insidious and thin, curling beneath the floorboards, a silent invasion. Panic flared. She ran for the stairstool fast, too careless in her haste. The overloaded bookshelf behind her, weakened by age and the encroaching flames, chose that precise moment to give way. It collapsed with a deafening crash, sending a cascade of ash, burning splinters, and toppling books into the already choking air. She covered her mouth with her sleeve, a futile gesture against the encroaching darkness, and dropped low to the ground, hoping to find a pocket of breathable air. But the smoke was already thick, a living, breathing entity, curling through the old wood like it knew every secret passage, every hidden weakness. The front door, her only escape, was downstairs, now an impossible distance through the inferno. The window, a quaint little thing meant for showcasing literary treasures, was far too small to offer a viable exit. Trapped. Across town, Kodiak sat alone in the dimly lit common room of the inn, staring blankly at the half-full mug of coffee Nico had abandoned. The lukewarm liquid swirled with unspoken words, a lingering reminder of a conversation cut short. A feeling of unease had settled over him, a prickling sensation he couldn't quite explain. Nico came rushing through the door, slamming it open with fury. Standing inside the doorway, breathless and wide-eyed. "Kodiak! Someone on the street is yelling that the bookstore's on fire!" he gasped, his voice tight with urgency. "We need to move." The mug remained untouched. Kodiak was on his feet before the last syllable finished leaving Nico's trembling mouth. Every nerve in his body screamed. "They are yelling that Cleo's still inside." The words were strained and laced with ice-cold fear. Smoke painted the twilight sky in grotesque ribbons of gray and angry orange, a horrific masterpiece of destruction. Flames, now fully unleashed, greedily climbed the back wall of the bookstore, devouring the aged wood with insatiable hunger as Kodiak reached the edge of the town square. A chaotic scene unfolded before him. People shouted frantic instructions, their faces illuminated by the hellish glow. A bucket chain had already formed, a desperate human attempt to fight the raging inferno. But the fire was fast, too relentless for such meager efforts. He didn't wait for orders, didn't ask for safety gear, didn't spare a thought for his well-being. All that mattered was Cleo. He charged into the narrow side alley, ignoring the pleas of onlookers, his focus narrowed to a single point: rescuing her. He found the rear door, a rickety wooden structure that seemed impossibly fragile in the face of the raging fire. Locked. He didn't hesitate. Adrenaline coursing through his veins, he ripped it open with a ferocious shoulder slam, the splintering wood a testament to his desperate strength. And then, without a backward glance, he vanished into the churning vortex of smoke and flames. Inside, it was chaos incarnate. The shelves had collapsed near the front, creating a treacherous landscape of burning debris. The cash register, once a symbol of the bookstore's livelihood, was already engulfed in flames, reduced to a molten, unrecognizable mess. The air was thick with the stench of burning paper and wood, a suffocating blanket that obscured everything. But above the roar of the fire, he heard her, a weak, rattling cough. A low, gasping sound, barely audible, came from the obscured corner near the staircase. Hope, a fragile ember, flickered in the darkness. "Cleo!" he roared, his voice raw with desperation, praying she could hear him. No answer, only the relentless crackle of the flames and the ominous groaning of the burning building. He moved fast, driven by a primal instinct to protect. Ignoring the searing heat, he dropped low, crawling beneath the worst of the smoke, his eyes stinging and watering. He pushed through the burning end-cap display, scattering charred books in his wake, fueled by a single, unwavering purpose. And then he saw her. Huddled on the stairwell landing, a small, fragile figure silhouetted against the inferno. Her arm was pressed tightly over her mouth, a pathetic attempt to filter the poisonous air. She was coughing hard, her body racked with violent spasms, her eyes barely open, glazed with pain and confusion. He didn't hesitate, not for a single heartbeat. He scooped her into his arms, cradling her against his chest, feeling the fragile weight of her body. He felt her hand weakly grab at his shirt, a desperate anchor in the swirling chaos. "I'm here," he said, his voice low and steady, a soothing balm against the terrifying reality. "I've got you." He knew he had to get her out, and he would gladly face the fire itself to do so. He carried her out the way he came, through flame, through smoke, through the wreckage of the place she'd built her peace. The heat licked at his exposed skin, the smoke stinging his lungs, but his focus remained solely on the weight cradled in his arms. Cleo. He wouldn't let her go. Not again. Outside, fresh air hit like a wave, a stark contrast to the suffocating inferno. It was clean, sharp, and shockingly real, after the nightmare they'd just escaped. Cleo gasped, a ragged, desperate intake of breath. She clung to him, her fingers digging into his jacket like anchors in a storm. Her legs buckled when he tried to set her down, her muscles shaking with delayed shock. Kodiak didn't hesitate. He stayed with her, kneeling in the dirt, the rough ground a stark contrast to the delicate woman in his arms. His arms tightened around her, a silent promise of protection. He whispered the only words that came to mind, a mantra against the chaos. "You're okay. I've got you. I've got you." The words were a lifeline, not just for her, but for him as well, a promise he intended to keep. Nico reached them seconds later, his face etched with worry, eyes wide with unspoken questions. "Is she—" "She's breathing," Kodiak said, his voice rough, reassuring. "She's okay." He tightened his hold on Cleo, as if daring anyone to contradict him. Nico crouched beside them, holding out a water bottle, the plastic crinkling in the sudden quiet. Cleo took it with trembling fingers, her knuckles white against the blue plastic. Her throat burned, raw from the smoke, rendering her speechless. But her eyes, wide and haunted, were locked on Kodiak, not in shock, though the aftermath of the fire warranted it. Not in fear, though flames still danced in the periphery, threatening to ignite new horrors. In recognition, a dawning understanding that flickered in their depths, a spark in the ashes. Later, when the flames were finally put out, reduced to glowing embers and hissing steam, and the last of the smoke had cleared, leaving a bitter tang in the air, she sat on the steps of the bakery with a blanket around her shoulders. It was one Nico had grabbed from inside, smelling faintly of cinnamon and hope. Kodiak stood nearby, a silent sentinel. He was singed at the edge of his sleeves, his face smudged with soot, a testament to the battle he'd fought to reach her. He watched the smoldering remains of the bookstore, the orange glow reflecting in his dark eyes. It was gone, reduced to ash and memories, but she wasn't, and he hadn't left her this time. The realization settled between them, unspoken but undeniable. Nico walked over and crouched beside her, his presence a comforting weight. "I'll talk to Elsner," he said, his voice low and steady, cutting through the silence. "We'll figure something out. A place to stay. Somewhere quiet. Away from all this." Cleo didn't look away from the flames. The fire had consumed everything, leaving her raw and exposed. He wasn't there today. He was visiting his family out of town. Nico nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. Lucky. She nodded too, a small, almost imperceptible movement. Then, quietly, without looking up, her voice raspy and strained. "Thank you." The words were barely audible, yet they hung in the air, heavy with unspoken emotion. Nico glanced toward Kodiak, a silent question in his eyes. She followed his gaze, drawn to the figure standing a few feet away. "I didn't call for him," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. The confession hung in the air, a fragile truth offered to the night. "You didn't have to," Nico said, his voice gentle, filled with understanding. Some connections transcended words, transcended needs. Kodiak stepped closer, closing the distance between them, stopping a few feet away. He didn't speak. He didn't offer platitudes or empty promises, just stood with her. Not in pity, because she didn't need his sympathy. Not in guilt, because the past was a heavy enough burden without adding more weight. In presence, a solid, unwavering force beside her in the face of utter devastation, and when she looked up at him, her gaze meeting his across the smoldering landscape, smoke still clinging to her hair and tears she refused to shed, stinging her eyes, she said the first words she'd meant in months, words that weren't rehearsed or guarded. "I don't know what happens next." The admission was raw, vulnerable, a stark contrast to the carefully constructed facade she'd worn for so long. Kodiak knelt in front of her, bringing himself down to her level, his hands resting on his thighs in a gesture of open honesty. "I don't either." He mirrored her vulnerability, offering her the truth instead of false assurances. He held her gaze, his dark eyes filled with a depth of emotion she couldn't quite decipher, a mixture of regret, hope, and unwavering resolve. "But I'll stay." The words were a promise, whispered in the ashes, a fragile ember of hope in the face of overwhelming loss. A promise that, this time, he intended to keep. Cleo sat on the steps of the bakery, the rough concrete cold even through the thick blanket wrapped around her. The blanket smelled of smoke, a grim reminder, overlaid with the mundane scent of someone else's laundry detergent, a stranger's kindness in the face of her devastation. Her arms trembled uncontrollably, small tremors that racked her body even though the fire was long extinguished, reduced to smoldering embers and lingering ash. Kodiak stood nearby, a silent sentinel. Soot streaked his face and clothes, turning his normally tanned complexion dull and gray. He didn't touch her, didn't offer a word of comfort, yet his presence was a tangible weight, grounding her to the reality that threatened to pull her under. Just there, the bookstore was gone. Reduced to charred remains, a hollowed-out shell of what it once was. Her home, the carefully curated shelves, the worn armchair where she'd lost herself in countless stories, the scent of old paper and brewing tea, all erased. Her sanctuary. The haven she'd built, the place where she felt safe and unseen. Her peace, the quiet corner of the world where she could breathe, gone. And yet she was alive. The stark, undeniable truth hit her all at once, a tidal wave crashing down after the adrenaline had finally begun to recede. She hadn't allowed herself to truly feel it, too busy with survival, too numb with shock. She'd almost died. If she hadn't smelled the smoke when she did, a faint tendril that had tickled her nose and roused her from sleep. If Kodiak hadn't gotten there in time, battling through the flames like a hero from one of her own stories. If one more bookshelf had fallen, pinning her beneath its weight, suffocating her in burning paper, she would have never made it out. The realization broke through her chest like a dam snapping, releasing a torrent of fear and grief she could no longer contain. She doubled over, clutching her stomach as if physically wounded, a ragged sob tearing from her throat. This wasn't a quiet sniffle, a composed expression of sadness. This was a real cry, raw and untamed, one she hadn't let herself feel since the bond broke, since she'd ripped herself away from everything she knew. The dam had held then, a desperate act of self-preservation. But now, with the threat of death so close, the dam had shattered. Her hands covered her face, and she wept for everything. For the fire, a destructive force that had taken everything she owned, everything she had painstakingly created. For the bond, that invisible thread that had once connected her so deeply to Kodiak and the pack, now frayed and tangled with guilt and regret. For the love she'd buried deep inside, the love that still lingered despite her best efforts, a constant ache in her soul. And for the girl she'd lost along the way, the confident, vibrant girl who had been swallowed by fear and uncertainty. Kodiak dropped to his knees beside her, the rough scrape of his jeans against the concrete the only sound for a moment. He hesitated only a second, as if unsure of his place, before gently, tentatively pulling her into his arms. She didn't resist. The fight drained out of her, leaving her limp and exhausted. She leaned in, burying her face in his shoulder, shaking, sobbing, finally letting it all out, unfiltered and unashamed, where someone could see it, where he could see it. "I almost died," she choked out, the words thick with tears, her fists gripping his shirt, bunching the fabric in her hands. "I almost died, and I didn't even have anyone to call." The loneliness of her self-imposed exile echoed in her voice, a stark and painful truth. His voice was low, a deep rumble that vibrated against her ear, steady and reassuring amidst the storm of her emotions. "You do now." She shook her head, the movement jerky and desperate. "I left for a reason. I had to go." The need to justify her actions, even now, burned within her. "I couldn't stay." "I know," he said, his voice laced with understanding, surprisingly devoid of judgment. "You were right to go. But I don't want to stay away anymore." Her voice cracked on the words, betraying the fragile hope that had taken root in her heart. "I want to go home." The word felt foreign and unfamiliar on her tongue, yet it resonated with a deep, primal longing. Kodiak's breath caught, a sharp intake of air that spoke volumes. He held her tighter, as if fearing she would vanish if he loosened his grip. She looked up at him through tear-soaked lashes, her eyes red and swollen, pleading for understanding and acceptance. "I don't mean the bookstore, I mean the pack," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I want to come back. I don't know if I'm ready to be your Luna, or anything, but I want my family back." The weight of her decision hung in the air between them, a fragile promise and a tentative step towards healing. What she didn't know was that just around the corner, hidden in the shadows, Nico stood still as stone, his face an unreadable mask. His arms were crossed tightly over his chest, a defensive posture that belied the turmoil churning within him. His jaw was clenched against his own rising emotion, a battle waged against the vulnerability he rarely allowed to surface. He didn't interrupt, respecting the delicate moment playing out before him. Didn't step in, knowing this conversation needed to happen between them, without interference. But his eyes glistened with unshed tears as he heard the crack in her voice, the raw emotion and the weight in her words. He knew Cleo. He knew the depth of her pride and the strength of her convictions. She wasn't coming back out of guilt, a sense of obligation, or a forced sense of duty. She was choosing them over her isolation, over her fear, over the perceived safety of being alone. Choosing a home, choosing her family, her pack, her place in the world. Back on the steps, Kodiak brushed a trembling strand of hair from Cleo's face, his touch gentle and feather-light. "I'll take you home," he said softly, his voice filled with a tenderness that melted the ice around her heart. "No pressure," she whispered, a weak attempt at humor that betrayed her vulnerability. "No expectations," he promised, his eyes locked on hers, conveying a sincerity that resonated deep within her soul. "Just stay." The plea was barely audible, a desperate whisper carried on the wind. "I will." And this time, he meant it. The promise hung in the air, a fragile thread of hope woven into the tapestry of their complicated past, a promise he intended to keep, no matter the cost. They crossed the border at sunrise, the harsh line between survival and something else, something that felt impossibly close to peace. The first rays of light caught on Cleo's bandaged arm, still red and angry beneath the wrappings. The burns throbbed, a constant reminder of what she'd faced, what she'd lost. She sat stiffly in the passenger seat of Nico's truck, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, a futile attempt to ward off the bone-deep chill of exhaustion. Her jaw was clenched tight, a silent battle against the fatigue creeping into her bones, threatening to drag her under. She didn't speak, didn't need to. Every word felt like an admission of weakness, and she couldn't afford that. Not yet. Kodiak sat silently behind the wheel of the vehicle that followed, his SUV a dark, watchful shadow. His eyes, usually so warm and expressive, were now laser-focused on the road ahead, a steely determination etched into his features. He was a hunter again, a protector, guarding his wounded prey. This was the first time he'd brought her home in over a year that felt like a lifetime. Each mile devoured by the tires was a testament to the chasm that had grown between them, but she wasn't the same woman. The fire had changed her, forged her, left her scarred in ways that bandages couldn't conceal. And this wasn't the same return. There were no banners, no cheering crowds, no celebratory feast. Only the stark reality of their situation hung heavy in the air. This wasn't a ceremony. There would be no formal welcome, no declarations of loyalty. It was survival. Just getting her back, keeping her alive, that was all that mattered. The packhouse came into view, a sprawling structure of stone and timber that stood as a beacon of strength and tradition against the backdrop of the rising sun. Nostalgia hit like a punch to the gut, a wave of bittersweet memories threatening to drown her. It was a potent cocktail of joy and sorrow, of what was and what could never be again. The front steps, worn smooth by generations of pack members. The tall windows, reflecting the golden light. The scent of pine and hearthfire carried on the morning breeze, the scent that used to mean home, safety, belonging. Now, it was just a reminder of what she'd almost lost forever. As Nico parked the truck, Cleo didn't move. She was a statue, frozen in place, as if afraid that any movement would shatter the fragile illusion of her return. Not until the front door opened, creaking slightly on its hinges, a sound that echoed through the silence like a gunshot. Not until the first sob broke the stillness, a raw, unrestrained sound of relief and joy that pierced through her defenses. Luna. It came from Leah, one of the mid-rank healers, her face pale and streaked with tears. She stumbled down the stairs barefoot and breathless, her voice cracking with emotion. Others followed, drawn by the sound, by the unspoken hope that had finally been realized. Voices, gasps, rushing footsteps, a symphony of reunion. Cleo was still awkwardly climbing out of the truck when arms wrapped around her, tentative at first, then tightening with increasing fervor. Then another set of arms, and another, a human shield against the pain and exhaustion. They weren't afraid to touch her, even with the bandages, even with the lingering scent of smoke and death clinging to her clothes. They weren't asking questions, demanding explanations, or probing for details about her ordeal. They were crying, openly and unashamedly, tears of relief and gratitude streaming down their faces. Sobbing, lost in the moment, overwhelmed by the sheer miracle of her return. Whispering prayers of thanks to the moon goddess, to whatever force had guided her back to them. And Cleo? The dam finally broke. The carefully constructed walls she'd erected around her heart crumbled. The tears came, silent but unstoppable, a torrent of grief, relief, and exhaustion. They fell freely, mingling with the tears of her pack, as she stood surrounded by the faces she thought she'd never see again, grounded by their love and loyalty. Enough. Back up, let her breathe. Nico's voice cut through the emotional chaos, firm but gentle. He was the anchor, the voice of reason in the storm. She's going straight to the infirmary. She's burned and exhausted. One hug each, people. We can overwhelm her later. Laughter rang out at that, wet, emotional, tinged with hysteria, but they obeyed. They knew Nico was right. Cleo needed rest. She needed healing, and they needed to give her the space to get it. Cleo was gently led inside, supported by a sea of loving hands. The pack house felt smaller now, warmer, filled with a vibrant energy that had been missing for so long. Kodiak hovered near the doorway, a silent guardian, letting the others reach her first. He watched them, his expression unreadable, as if afraid to break the spell. He didn't want to take a single moment from them, from their reunion. He knew that later he would have his chance, but for now he would simply observe, a silent sentinel. The infirmary smelled like antiseptic and chamomile, a calming blend designed to soothe both body and mind. It was the kind of place built to promote healing, a sanctuary within the pack house walls. She was eased into a soft bed, the sheets cool and crisp against her skin. Her arm was carefully unwrapped by the senior healer, Mara, her touch gentle and expert. "This is going to sting," she warned, her voice calm and reassuring. "It already does," Cleo muttered, trying to smile, but the pain was a constant, gnawing presence. "You've got second-degree burns across the forearm and a few smoke lesions on the lungs," Mara explained, her eyes filled with concern. "You'll need bed rest for at least a few days, and fluids. Lots of them." "I've had worse," Cleo whispered, her voice hoarse with exhaustion. "You've never been missed more," Mara replied gently, her words a balm to Cleo's wounded spirit. Outside the glass doors, Kodiak stood motionless, hands clenched behind his back, his knuckles white. He was a statue of pent-up emotion, a coiled spring ready to release. Not pacing, not speaking. He was a study in stillness, his focus solely on Cleo, just watching, making sure she was safe, that she was being cared for, waiting for the moment when he could finally speak to her, touch her, and know that she was truly home. By mid-afternoon, Cleo was settled into one of the Luna's private recovery rooms. It was her old room, the one she had occupied before everything changed. Clean sheets, warm tea on the nightstand. Nico had brought her a pile of books she hadn't touched in months, their familiar titles a comforting presence. "Thank you, my friend. My brother, for everything," she rasped, her voice still rough from the smoke. "I'm just glad you're back, Luna," Nico said, sitting on the arm of the chair beside her, his gaze filled with fond affection. "And for the record, your room still smells like you. Weird, huh?" She smiled weakly, a flicker of her old self. Not weird, just meant to be. It was a small victory, a sliver of hope in the darkness. Before he left, Nico stood in the doorway, his gaze gentle, filled with a promise of unwavering support. "Sleep, heal. We're all here. You're safe now." She closed her eyes, finally letting the warmth of the bed pull her under, surrendering to the exhaustion that threatened to consume her. But before she drifted off, before the darkness completely enveloped her, she whispered something just for her, a quiet affirmation, a fragile hope. "I'm home." And this time, she believed it. The words resonated within her, a soothing balm to her wounded soul. She was home, surrounded by her pack, by the people who loved her. And that, she realized, was all that mattered. Cleo woke slowly, the kind of slow that happens when the body no longer needs to survive, just rest, when the adrenaline finally bleeds out, leaving a dull ache in its wake. Her throat ached, dry and scratchy. Her arm burned under the fresh wrappings, a persistent throb that reminded her, with every pulse, what she had endured. But for the first time in what felt like forever, her chest didn't feel like it was trying to cave in. The crushing weight that had settled there, a constant companion of fear and grief, had finally lifted, if only a little. Sunlight slipped through the gap in the curtains, soft and gold, painting stripes across the floor and warming the air. It felt almost normal. She blinked against it, breath catching, as she adjusted to the stillness. The world felt muted, distant, as if she were watching it through a veil, a far cry from the chaos and terror of the last few days. Then she turned her head and saw him. Kodiak was asleep in the chair beside her bed, a standard hospital-issue chair, molded plastic and unforgiving, yet he occupied it with a strange kind of grace. His head rested near her hand, tilted at an awkward angle, arms crossed protectively over his chest, legs stretched awkwardly out in front of him, as though he'd tried to take up as little space as possible. His jacket had been tossed over the back of the chair, a crumpled heap of leather and worn denim. His boots were scuffed from pacing, the laces undone, a testament to restless nights. And his face, he looked younger like this, tired and still, the lines of worry etched around his eyes, softened in sleep, but unguarded, vulnerable. The hard edges that had sharpened over the past few years seemed to have momentarily receded. Like the Kodiak she remembered from long ago, the one who used to fall asleep with his forehead against hers, hand on her hip, muttering nonsense into her neck. A lifetime ago, it felt. Before everything had fallen apart, he hadn't just waited, he hadn't left at all. Despite everything, he had stayed. Her fingers moved before she could stop them, betraying her weariness and her cautious hope. A silent question, a tentative offering. She reached out, slow, uncertain, and ran them gently through his hair. Thick, dark strands, a little longer than she remembered, falling across his forehead, soft. An unexpected softness that made her breath catch in her throat. He stirred but didn't wake, a low groan rumbling in his chest. He shifted slightly, nuzzling his cheek deeper into the back of his hand. She let her hand fall to rest beside his cheek, hovering just above the stubble that shadowed his jaw. She resisted the urge to trace the sharp line of his cheekbone, to map the familiar contours of his face. A moment passed, filled with the quiet rhythm of their breathing and the gentle hum of the hospital machinery. The air crackled with unspoken words, with years of history and regret and tentative hope. Then his eyes opened. The dark green irises, usually so guarded, were clouded with sleep, unfocused. They met hers, and a flicker of surprise, then something deeper, crossed his face. "Hey," he said, voice hoarse with sleep. The sound vibrated through her, a familiar tremor that stirred something deep within her. She gave him a soft smile, a genuine smile that reached her eyes for the first time in she couldn't remember how long. "You're drooling on my blanket." He blinked, the haze of sleep lifting as awareness flooded his features. He sat up quickly, awkwardly, rubbing his face with his hands. Shit, sorry. I didn't mean to. I didn't say I minded. The words slipped out before she could censor them. A quiet admission. A fragile olive branch. Kodiak froze, his hand still pressed against his cheek. The movement stilled, the breath held in his lungs. Then looked at her. Really looked. Not at the bandages, not at the pallor of her skin, but at her. He looked into her, and saw it. Her eyes, the window to her soul, finally unclouded. Open, clear, not forgiving, not yet. There was still a long road ahead of them, but present, grounded, ready. You stayed, she whispered, the words thick with emotion. A question and a statement, all in one. I wasn't going to leave you again. The words were simple, but the conviction in his voice was undeniable. A promise etched in the depths of those green eyes. Cleo nodded. A slow, deliberate movement. The tension in her shoulders eased just a fraction. Good. He sat forward, elbows on his knees, lacing his fingers together. He kept a careful distance between them, like he wasn't sure how close was too close, afraid of shattering the fragile peace that had settled between them. I wanted to talk to you, she said, voice quiet but firm. She needed to say these words, needed to lay the foundation for whatever came next. I wanted to talk too. I just didn't want to rush you. I wanted to give you time to heal. She shifted on the bed, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at the bandages on her arm. She patted the mattress beside her, making room. Come closer, she said, please. The word was barely a whisper, a plea for connection, a desperate hope for reconciliation. He obeyed, carefully, deliberately, like she might vanish if he moved wrong, like she was made of spun glass and could shatter at the slightest touch. He rose from the chair and sat gingerly on the edge of the bed, his gaze fixed on hers, searching for any sign of retreat. I was so angry with you, she said, voice quiet, raw with emotion. Not just for what happened, but for how easily you let me walk away, for not fighting for me. I wasn't letting you go, he said, his voice low and husky. I was lost. I didn't know how to fix things. You were weak. The accusation hung in the air between them, heavy with resentment. He nodded, his gaze unwavering. I let my demons consume me, and I pushed you away in the process. I trusted you. The words were a lament, a reminder of the bond they had once shared, the unwavering faith she had placed in him. And I broke that. He flinched, the admission of visible wound. I know I did, and I'm so sorry. Her fingers curled around the blanket, bunching the fabric in her fist. The pain was still there, the scars still raw, but something had shifted inside her. But I'm tired of holding all the pieces alone, she admitted, the vulnerability in her voice mirroring the uncertainty in her eyes. I can't do it anymore. He looked at her then, really looked at her, eyes dark and quiet, filled with a depth of emotion that mirrored her own, a promise of unwavering support, a silent vow. I'll hold them with you, Cleo, I promise, for always. The silence settled around them, not heavy with unspoken accusations, but safe and comforting, like a warm blanket on a cold night. The remnants of their argument, the echoes of harsh words spoken in anger and fear, seemed to dissipate, leaving behind a quiet understanding. Then softly, barely audible above the rustle of leaves outside the window, I missed you, she said, her voice raspy with emotion, even when I hated you. Especially then, maybe. He exhaled slowly, a long, drawn-out breath filled with regret and longing. I missed you with every breath. It was like trying to breathe through water. She gave a tired laugh, a sound that was both fragile and genuine. That's dramatic even for you. I'm making up for all the stupid I've been. For every lie, every wrong decision, every moment I wasn't there when I should have been. Then you've got a lot of catching up to do, she quipped. But the edge in her voice had softened, replaced by a glimmer of hope. Their hands, lying between them on the worn blanket, tentatively sought each other, just fingertips at first, brushing against skin, a silent question asked and answered. Then palms met, a hesitant connection forming. Finally, fingers interlaced, weaving together as if they were meant to be, a symbol of unity after so much separation. He looked down at their joined hands, the contrast of his tanned skin against hers, a visual representation of their differences, but also their undeniable connection. He looked up at her then, his eyes searching hers, filled with vulnerability and a plea for understanding. "Cleo, I don't know what comes next. I don't want to assume anything, not after—" He trailed off, unable to articulate the depths of his past mistakes. She squeezed his hand, her touch offering reassurance and forgiveness. "Then don't assume. Let's just see." A pause hung in the air, thick with unspoken hopes and lingering fears. The future stretched before them, uncertain and unwritten. "Just stay," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "Stay. For now. I will." The words were a promise, a vow, whispered from the depths of his soul. "I'm not going anywhere." Cleo, emboldened by his words, by the sincerity in his gaze, cupped her hands on either side of his face, her thumbs gently tracing the lines of his jaw. She leaned in and kissed him, a kiss that was not just a kiss, but a culmination of all the love, sorrow, and pain they had endured. It was a kiss that spoke of forgiveness sought and given, of second chances and the fragile hope of a future together. He returned the kiss with the fervor of a man who had finally understood the magnitude of his mistakes, a man determined never to repeat them. His kiss was a promise of devotion, of unwavering commitment, of a love that had been tested and, against all odds, had survived. Their love would take time to rebuild, brick by agonizing brick. The foundation was cracked, the walls were weakened, but the structure was still standing. They would need patience, understanding, and unwavering dedication to restore it to its former glory, or perhaps to build something even stronger, something forged in the fires of adversity. Outside the room, Nico stood with his back to the wall, arms crossed over his chest, eyes closed. The hallway was quiet, the morning sun streaming through the window at the end of the corridor. He'd brought breakfast an hour ago, a tray laden with fresh fruit, warm pastries, and strong coffee, but he hadn't knocked. He'd sensed the tension in the air, the fragile peace that needed nurturing. Didn't need to knock. He heard everything, the rise and fall of their voices, the soft murmur of apologies, and the unspoken emotions that resonated through the thin walls. And for once in his life, Nico let himself smile without holding it back, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached his eyes. He was a protector, a guardian, and seeing them find their way back to each other, seeing the possibility of happiness bloom amid so much darkness, filled him with a quiet satisfaction. He knew the road ahead would be long and arduous, but for now, in this moment, everything felt right. He turned and walked away, leaving them to their privacy, to their tentative reconciliation, knowing that sometimes the greatest act of love was simply giving people the space they needed to heal. The sky radiated silver glory, casting a sacred hush over the clearing. The air crackled with anticipation, thick with the scent of pine and the unspoken weight of history. Cleo stood at the edge of the ceremonial circle, her white dress flowing like starlight spun into silk. It moved with her breath, a whispering testament to the life she now embraced. Around her, wolves from every allied pack stood in respectful silence, a sea of fur and gleaming eyes, reflecting the moon's ethereal light. Even the trees seemed to bow under the weight of what was about to occur, their leaves rustling in a reverent murmur. This wasn't just a renewal of vows. It wasn't a simple reaffirmation of a promise already made. This was more. It was a rebirth of a sacred bond long thought shattered, a phoenix rising from the ashes of betrayal and pain. It was a testament to the power of choice, the strength of forgiveness, and the enduring resilience of love. She looked ahead. Kodiak stood tall at the opposite end of the circle, a figure of strength and quiet determination bathed in the silvery light. He was dressed in deep forest green, the color of grounding, of strength, of the unwavering commitment he now embodied. His shoulders were broad, his stance steady, but his gaze was soft as it found hers. His eyes, as always, sought hers first, not with the desperation of a man clinging to redemption, desperately seeking forgiveness for past sins, but with the reverence of a mate who finally understood what love truly meant: sacrifice, trust, and unwavering devotion. As Cleo stepped forward, barefoot on the cool moonlit earth, the breeze lifted the scent of lavender and pine, a delicate perfume that spoke of healing and renewal. The ground beneath her feet pulsed with a subtle energy, a living heartbeat connecting her to the land and the magic that thrummed beneath its surface. Nico stood between them, hands raised, his face solemn. The beta had chosen to officiate, a testament to his unwavering loyalty and deep affection for them both. His voice carried strong and steady, resonating with the authority he held as second in command, but tinged with the warmth of a true friend. We gather under the moon's truth, not to bind a new bond, but to honor one broken and healed by choice. His words hung in the air, each syllable imbued with the profound significance of the moment. He acknowledged the past, the pain, and the struggle, but emphasized the conscious decision they had made to rebuild, to forgive, to love again. Cleo reached out, her hand trembling slightly with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. Kodiak's fingers curled gently around hers, his touch firm and reassuring, grounding her in the present. The warmth of his skin radiated through her, chasing away the lingering chill of doubt. "The moon goddess hears your truth," Nico continued, his voice rising slightly to carry to the furthest reaches of the clearing. "But tonight, she answers." A hush fell. The wind stilled. The leaves ceased their whispering. Every wolf in the clearing dropped to their knees, heads bowed in deference, their respect palpable in the silence. The only sound was the frantic beating of Cleo's own heart. From the shadows between the trees, a glow emerged. Not sunlight, not moonlight, something older, something primal, something inherently divine. A figure stepped forward, veiled in silver mist, radiating power and grace, hair like midnight wind, cascading down her back in shimmering waves, skin like a pearl, luminous and flawless, eyes that mirrored the stars themselves, holding the wisdom of ages within their depths. The moon goddess. She stood before Cleo and Kodiak without fanfare, without ceremony, but the ground itself thrummed with her presence, vibrating with the raw, untamed energy that emanated from her being. Her presence was a palpable weight, a tangible force that pressed down on them, demanding their attention and their honesty. "You severed the bond I gave you," she said, her voice both echoing and whispering, resonating deep within their souls. It was the sound of the wind whistling through ancient canyons, the rustling of leaves in a primeval forest, the whisper of secrets carried on the night air. And yet, you chose each other again. Not because of destiny, not because of instinct, but because of the truth. That is sacred. That is stronger than anything I ever designed. Her words were not an accusation, but an observation, a recognition of the extraordinary power of their choice. Tears welled in Cleo's eyes. Not out of fear, not out of regret, out of awe, out of gratitude, out of the profound understanding that she had been given a second chance, a gift she didn't deserve but was determined to cherish. The goddess stepped closer, her gaze piercing and compassionate. She reached toward them, her movements fluid and graceful. With one finger, she touched their joined hands, her touch sending a jolt of pure energy through their veins. A soft pulse radiated outward a silvery thread, wrapping around their wrists like moonlight spun into silk, binding them together once more, but with a stronger, more resilient connection. "I give you this once more not because you are fated," she said, her voice softening, filled with a warmth that belied her ethereal appearance, "but because you are worthy." The bond reignited hot and wild, a surge of passion and desire that threatened to consume them. Then, deep and steady, a calming presence that soothed their souls. It wasn't like before. It was more. It was tempered by experience, forged in the fires of adversity, and strengthened by the unwavering commitment they had made to one another. Their hearts beat in sync, a perfect rhythm that echoed the harmony of the universe. Their scents merged, creating a unique and intoxicating aroma that spoke of their shared history and their enduring love. Their souls found each other again, not through the haze of the mating pool, not through the forceful insistence of destiny, but in clarity, in choice, in healed trust. The moon goddess stepped back, her gaze lingering on Cleo, a knowing smile playing on her lips. "You were never just Luna," she said, her voice filled with a profound understanding. "You were always light. Don't forget that." Then she vanished into mist, dissolving back into the shadows from whence she came, leaving behind a circle glowing with warmth and magic, illuminated by the radiant love that now bound Cleo and Kodiak together. Nico lowered his hands, his face etched with emotion. "By the sacred rite of renewal, you are bound again, Kodiak, Cleo. My Alpha, my Luna, my friends." His voice cracked slightly, overcome by the weight of the moment, then steadied, filled with unwavering support. "You are home." The crowd erupted, not in wild celebration, not in the unbridled frenzy of a pack claiming their leaders, but in a thunderous howl, a unified song of approval, of reverence, of welcome. It was a symphony of wolfish joy, a testament to the healing that had taken place within their pack, and a celebration of the love that had brought them all together. Cleo turned to Kodiak, tears sliding down her cheeks, tears of joy, of relief, of overwhelming gratitude. "You waited," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I'd have waited another lifetime if you asked me to," he replied, his voice husky with emotion, his eyes filled with a love that transcended words. She smiled, a radiant expression that lit up her face and transformed her into something truly breathtaking. "Then it's good you didn't have to." And in that moment, under the benevolent gaze of the full moon, surrounded by their pack and the sacred echo of the divine, they kissed softly, tentatively at first, then powerfully, passionately, like two souls remembering how it felt to be whole, like two halves of a single heart finally reunited. Their kiss was a promise, a vow, a testament to the enduring power of love, and a celebration of the new beginning that lay before them. The broken bond was mended, the past was forgiven, and the future was theirs to build together. That's the end of this tale. But in the world of the supernatural, there's always another shadow waiting. Thank you for staying with me through every twist, turn, and heartbeat. If you enjoyed the ride, there's more waiting for you. Just check out the other audiobooks on this channel. Don't forget to subscribe if you want more magic, more monsters, and more stories that go bump in the night. Until next time, stay curious, stay brave, and never stop listening. That's the end of this tale. But in the world of the supernatural, there's always another shadow waiting. Thank you for staying with me through every twist, turn, and heartbeat. If you enjoyed the ride, there's more waiting for you. Just check out the other audiobooks on this channel. Don't forget to subscribe if you want more magic, monsters, and stories that go bump in the night. Until next time, stay curious and brave and never stop listening.